The first chill didn't announce itself with ceremony. It simply crept in as though slipping through an unnoticed crack in the wall. One day the air held a faint sting, and the next the frost had settled like a silent decree from nature. This was how the people of centuries past came to know winter had arrived. Not through clocks or forecasts, but through the instinctive tightening of their shoulders and the way the earth hardened underfoot. For those who lived in the medieval age, this moment marked the start of a long, merciless season, not just of ice and wind, but of testing their strength, their resolve, their very will to see another spring. Imagine the landscape turning from green to grey. The trees no longer murmured in the wind, but stood as frozen skeletons, their leaves long vanished. The ground, once soft and full of promise, transformed into a barren crust that no plough could hope to penetrate. The sun, ever more reluctant, dipped lower in the sky each day until it became little more than a pale ornament hanging above the horizon, offering neither warmth nor comfort. With its retreat came a darkness not just in light but in spirit. The days shortened, but the nights lengthened into something vast, a slow stretch of hours where the cold whispered in through every stone, wood and seam of the world. For the average soul, those who tilled land that was never theirs to claim, the turning of the season wasn't just poetic, it was dangerous. They didn't speak in terms of degrees or weather fronts. They measured winter in dwindling bread loaves, in how many logs were left stacked by the door, in the coughs that refused to leave a child's chest. Their world shrank in those months, contracting from open fields and village gatherings into tight spaces crowded with people, animals, and a shared hope that this year might be gentler than the last. Step inside one of those homes, a structure more patched than planned, with smoke trailing lazily out of a hole that served as a chimney. The walls might be daub and wattle, smeared with earth and straw meant to keep the wind at bay but never truly succeeding. Inside it was dim, even in the height of day, and the air hung heavy with a blend of smells. Soot, unwashed bodies, old stew. The sour tang of livestock penned in close proximity. And yet this was safety, of a kind. People slept huddled together on straw pallets or rough blankets, sometimes pressing up against animals not just for utility but for warmth. The concept of personal space had no place here. Survival demanded closeness. Food was another matter entirely. The generous harvest celebrations of autumn felt like another lifetime. Now, each meal was an exercise in frugality and luck. Perhaps a crust of bread, coarse and dry from weeks in the storage bin. A bowl of gruel, barely seasoned. Perhaps bulked up with whatever wild greens hadn't been smothered under the snow, if they were fortunate. Some dried beans or salted pork might have been saved. The truly lucky still had cheese hard enough to require a knife just to shave off a sliver. For most, however, hunger was a constant hum beneath the surface of every day. The weak grew weaker, and the strong merely endured. Even the wealthy weren't spared the season's bite, though their experience of it came with layers of fur and roaring fires. In draughty castles made of stone, the cold was an uninvited guest that defied tapestries and servants' best efforts. The nobility wrapped themselves in wool and velvet, but still found their fingers numb and their breath visible. Their cooks toiled over massive hearths, not only preparing meals but also providing essential heat for the household. Fires burned constantly, consuming an endless supply of timber. Rooms were kept closed, their heavy wooden doors braced against the draughts, yet still the cold snuck in like a cunning thief. In the countryside, where peasants worked land owned by absent lords, each day became a negotiation with nature. The animals they depended on, cows for milk, chickens for eggs, goats for both, required shelter and fodder, and those weren't always in abundance. Hay had to be stored from the summer months, and if it ran out before the thaw, the animals began to die. With them went not just meat, but milk, leather, labour. Every life lost was a piece of a family's survival snapped away. People watched the skies not in hope of clear weather, but in dread of more snow. A late freeze could undo even the most careful planning. Disease flourished in these tight, cold quarters. It started small, a sniffle, a cough, the weariness that clung even after sleep, but it spread with alarming speed. Influenza, pneumonia, and other unnamed fevers swept through households with cruel efficiency. A child might go to sleep with a minor chill and never wake again. Entire families vanished over the course of a month, their homes left to collapse under snowdrifts, And yet, there were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no understanding beyond the spiritual. Illness was punishment, or so many believed, a trial sent by powers greater than themselves. They prayed, fasted, made offerings in the hope that divine mercy might spare them one more year. Yet despite all of this, they endured. Perhaps it was the shared burden that made the unbearable survivable. Communities didn't merely coexist, they intertwined. A neighbour's suffering was not ignored, for everyone understood that their own time might come next. It was not uncommon for a family with barely enough to share what they had with another, whose situation was even more dire: a bowl of broth, a piece of firewood, a shoulder to lean on. In those moments, the line between survival and compassion blurred. People lived close not only out of necessity but also from a deeper understanding that unity was their only armour against the indifferent cold. And in the midst of this hard season, there were traditions designed not just to entertain but to lift spirits, to provide some rhythm in a time that otherwise stretched endlessly. The Feast of Midwinter brought with it songs and laughter, even if the fare was humble. In some places, the poorest among them would be named king for a day, turning the rigid hierarchy on its head in a gesture of festive defiance. They laughed, not because they had no reason to mourn, but because laughter was one of the last freedoms the cold couldn't take. Stories were passed around like treasures. Around the hearth, voices told of great heroes and mythical beasts, of saints who cured with a touch and villains who met poetic justice. These tales weren't just distractions, they were lifelines, reminders that there were other times, other places and better endings. They were repositories of cultural memory, binding generations together with a shared sense of identity, of who they were and what they believed was worth preserving. Children learned early what it meant to endure. Their games took place in icy fields, their toys carved from scraps. They learned to fetch water from frozen wells, to carry firewood that outweighed them, to tend to animals nearly as tall as they were. But they also learned resilience, the kind that roots deep and never quite leaves, even in adulthood. They grew up understanding that suffering was not something to be feared, but something to be met with quiet determination. Even religion, which held sway over every facet of life, transformed in the cold. Churches became refuges not just of spirit, but of warmth, often the only place where a stone hearth might crackle cheerfully during a vigil. People gathered not just to worship, but to survive. The rituals of the season, midnight masses, processions, fasts and feast days, gave structure to the otherwise formless grey of winter. They were something to mark the passage of time, to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. Some winters were worse than others. There were years when the cold seemed to arrive with vengeance, cloaking everything in white until even the colour of the earth was forgotten. Rivers froze so deeply that people held markets on the ice. Horses pulled carts across what had been swift-running water. It was novel at first, almost magical, but magic turns to menace when the frost never lifts. In those years, entire regions starved. The ground didn't just resist farming, it rejected life. Livestock froze where they stood. Babies were born into homes too cold to sustain them. People began to wonder whether spring would ever come, and yet it always did. That was the miracle. However long the night stretched, however deep the snow piled, however cruel the winds howled, the sun always returned. The rivers broke their icy chains and ran free. The first buds pushed through thawing earth. The crows, silent for so long, began to call once more from branches that now carried the first hints of green. And when it came, it was celebrated not with fanfare, but with a slow, reverent joy. The returning warmth was not taken for granted. It was earned, paid for in cold nights and thin soup and the stubborn refusal to give up. This is how they lived. Through the frost and the fever, through hunger and loss, with bare hands and borrowed hope, they moved forward. Their winters were not tidy seasons with snowmen and sleigh bells. They were brutal, raw and relentless. But they were also beautiful in their own way. Beautiful in the way survival always is. Not because of what was endured, but because of who endured it. And so when we, centuries later, sit in our heated homes and watch the snow fall softly outside our double-glazed windows, perhaps we might pause and remember them, not with pity, but with awe. For theirs was a winter that demanded everything, and yet they gave more, and they did so year after year, guided by nothing but grit, belief, and the knowledge that the cold, no matter how vast, could never outlast the light. The second part of winter did not begin with a storm or a sudden drop in temperature. It began in silence. That particular hush, known only to those who have lived through long seasons of ice, settled over the land like a woolen shroud soaked in cold. No birds called, no brooks babbled. Even the wind, once howling through the bare trees, quieted into a solemn sigh. This was the heart of winter in the medieval world, the time when nature herself seemed to draw breath and wait, holding the world in a kind of suspended animation. By now, any illusions that the cold might pass quickly had been stripped away. The snow no longer glittered with novelty, but pressed down on rooftops and weighed upon spirits. Trees bent under its burden. Pathways disappeared beneath layers of white. The sky remained an oppressive grey, featureless and unforgiving for days at a time. Time slowed. Days bled into each other in an endless loop of waking to chill, struggling to stay warm, and sleeping through darkness that came too soon. For the people of medieval Europe, this was the most punishing stage, the stretch where endurance began to fray and desperation took root. Inside the cottages that dotted the countryside, families had retreated into themselves. The space grew tighter with every passing day, not physically but emotionally. Patience thinned as quickly as food. It was no longer uncommon to hear arguments, the low murmurs of worry turning into sharp exchanges, particularly when another day's meal required more creativity than ingredients. Fathers stared silently into the fire, contemplating how to stretch the last sack of flour, or whether to slaughter the hen that hadn't laid in weeks. Mothers looked to their children, their eyes flitting between rosy cheeks one day and pale lips the next, wondering which small cough might signal the start of something worse. Children, of course, understood little of the fears that hung in the air like a fog. Their instincts were sharper than their vocabulary. They felt the tension in how tightly hands were held, how hushed voices became in the evening. The games they invented grew quieter, less boisterous. A simple piece of twine or a small wooden figure carved from leftover firewood became a prized treasure, passed between siblings as both toy and comfort. Laughter came less easily now, but when it did emerge, it carried with it the kind of light only found in dark places. There were those who tried to lift spirits in other ways. In some villages, the local storyteller would make their rounds, braving the snow to sit by different hearths and tell tales passed down for generations. These weren't always heroic sagas. Often they were stories of clever peasants outwitting greedy lords, or of animals who found warmth through kindness. The moral thread was simple but essential. Generosity could be stronger than suffering, and humour could exist even where hunger did. In this way, the storytellers served a greater function than mere entertainment. They were lifelines, stitching together the fraying fabric of hope. But while the fires of imagination could glow bright, they did little to fight the cold that penetrated through every surface. Clothes that had served well in milder weather now felt thin as paper. Layers were added, patched and stitched, but they were never quite enough. Some families sewed straw into their garments, desperate to trap even a sliver of warmth. Boots were stuffed with rags, holes repaired with twine or rawhide, and still the snow found its way in. It soaked feet until they numbed and then burned. Frostbite was not a word they used then, but they knew it intimately, first in the tingling, then in the blackening tips of fingers and toes, and finally in the quiet agony of loss. And yet not everyone stayed indoors. For some, there was no choice but to venture out. The forests, though barren, still held secrets. A keen eye might spot a squirrel's abandoned stash of acorns, or a hollow tree that offered shelter for birds. The most skilled foragers knew where to dig beneath the snow for hardy winter greens, or clusters of mushrooms that clung to fallen logs. These discoveries were rare and precious, often carried back in cold-numbed hands and offered to the family as though they were treasures. In truth, they were. A handful of wild garlic could turn a tasteless broth into something almost luxurious. A pocket of frozen berries, found clinging stubbornly to a bush, could spark a moment of celebration. Hunters too took to the woods, though their quarry was as scarce as the sun. Rabbits, foxes, even the occasional boar became harder to track as the snow deepened, and the cold numbed the scent of man and beast alike. Traps were set with care, baited with the last of the fat or scraps from a previous catch. Sometimes they returned empty, sometimes they returned snapped shut on nothing but air. But once in a while a rabbit or bird was found, stiff with cold, offering meat and hide both. Such luck was never wasted. Every part of the animal was used, from bones boiled for broth to fur sewn into mittens. Waste was not just frowned upon, it was forbidden by necessity. But beyond the woods and fields, the cold wreaked havoc in the villages and towns themselves. The roads were treacherous, slick with ice hidden beneath snow. Wagons skidded or overturned. Horses slipped and broke legs. Travel slowed to a crawl, and many simply chose not to leave at all. Trade routes froze along with the rivers, and markets shrank. What once bustled with goods and chatter now offered little more than root vegetables and salted fish, and even those at exorbitant prices. For the poor, it was a season of watching, waiting for alms, for surplus, for mercy. And not all waited patiently. Desperation gave rise to acts unthinkable in gentler months. Thefts increased, not out of greed, but out of raw need. A loaf taken from a windowsill. A chicken snatched from an unguarded pen. These were not crimes of opportunity, but of survival. Punishments were harsh, for even small thefts threatened the fragile balance of community resources. And yet there was often a silent understanding among neighbours. A widow's missing loaf might not be reported, a stolen potato might be quietly overlooked. Mercy in winter was sometimes valued more than justice. And in those same communities, there were people whose very role was to serve the greater good. The clergy, often among the few who had regular access to warmth and food, found themselves in the unenviable position of deciding how much to share. Many gave freely, opening monastery doors to the sick and starving, distributing bread and broth to those who waited in lines that grew longer each day. Others held tightly to their stores, citing divine plans or the need for prudence. Still, the churches were full, not just because of spiritual need, but because they offered refuge, a bench by the fire, a roof that didn't leak, a place to rest weary limbs without fear of the elements. The season also brought a sharp clarity to the fragility of life. Death, which in other seasons arrived with discretion, now came openly. There were few burials, the ground was too hard, the dead were often wrapped in cloth and stored in outbuildings, waiting for a spring thaw. Families mourned quietly, grief dulled by exhaustion and the pressing demands of the living. Sometimes neighbours helped. Sometimes there was no one left to notice a life had ended, until the smell drifted from a door left unopened too long. And yet, through all of this, the hunger, the cold, the illness, the grief, people found ways to persist. They carved small moments of joy from the ice. The first time a sunbeam lingered just a little longer than the day before, someone noticed. A child laughed as icicles snapped from the eaves and shattered like glass. A man, returning empty-handed from a hunting trip, stumbled across an early bud pushing through the snow and brought it home like a trophy. These tiny signs were enough. They didn't chase away the cold, but they reminded people it wouldn't last forever. The turn came slowly, not with a sunrise or a thunderclap, but with a subtle shift. A drip from a roof, a softening in the snow's crust, the smell of wet earth, faint but unmistakable, and with it, a stirring. Hope, that fragile but persistent flame, began to grow stronger. Plans were made, seeds were counted, tools were repaired. The great wheel of the year was beginning to turn again, and those who had endured began to look forward, not just with longing, but with purpose. But they didn't forget. The lessons of winter were etched deeply, on their bodies, in their memories, within the very rhythm of their lives. They remembered which neighbours shared and which hoarded, which families pulled together and which fell apart. They remembered the quiet bravery of those who stood watch through long nights, and the silent collapse of those who simply could not bear one more morning of frost. And in remembering, they prepared. For next year, for the year after. They saved a little more, sealed the roof a little tighter, laid plans for helping others, knowing they might be the ones in need next time. Winter, in that way, it was not just a season. It was a teacher, harsh, unforgiving but honest. It revealed character. It stripped away illusion. It left behind not just survivors, but people who knew exactly what they could endure and what they had to give. So when the first flowers bloomed and the first lambs took their shaky steps, the joy wasn't simply about beauty, it was about validation. They had made it, again, together. And with each year, that simple truth became more sacred. The cold would return, the snow would fall again, but so too would the people rise, as they always had, as they always would. The third phase of winter did not bring relief. Instead, it deepened. The snow, once a blanket, hardened into a crusty shell that encased the world. Trees groaned under its weight. Rivers slowed to sluggish whispers beneath their frozen sheaths. It was no longer merely cold, it was as if the world itself had been placed in a vice, and every living thing strained against its tightening grip. For those who had survived the first wave of hunger and chill, this part of the season presented a new, more insidious challenge: endurance of monotony, despair, and the thinning line between resilience and surrender. By now, the taste of salt clung to everything. Salted meat, salted broth, salted fish. The freshness of autumn's apples, of soft cheeses and green vegetables, was a memory so distant it might have belonged to another lifetime. No one chewed with satisfaction anymore. They simply ate to quiet the growling of their stomachs, to keep the body moving through another sunless day. The meals grew thinner, more like suggestions of nourishment than anything truly satisfying. Even the bread was different, often stretched with ground bark or oats swept from the floor, anything to give it weight. The smell of boiling bones became a constant in villages, not because there were enough bones to boil for true broth, but because people hoped that heat, mixed with hope, might offer something more than it did. The air inside homes was thick, not just with smoke, but with a silence that had shape and weight. Conversations dulled. Words were spent like coin sparingly, as if to conserve warmth. The walls, never thick enough, seemed to close in. The corners grew darker. Shadows from the hearth stretched across straw-strewn floors, flickering in rhythms as familiar as breath. Eyes, once bright with shared memories or even mischief, now stared at the fire with a dull stillness, as if afraid that any movement might fracture something too fragile to fix. Somewhere in the village a dog barked, sharp, sudden. That kind of sound cut through the cold like a blade, and for a brief second everyone paused. It might have been a stranger passing or a scavenger animal. Or maybe it was nothing. But even that kind of interruption could serve as a reminder that the outside world still moved, even if just barely. That somewhere beyond the snowdrifts and frozen fences, time was still ticking forward, even if they couldn't feel it yet. Travel had long since stopped. Even the most daring merchants had packed away their goods, their carts buried under snow in storage sheds and barns. The roads were not just dangerous, they were erased. Paths that had connected village to village, friend to friend, now lay beneath treacherous layers of ice and indistinguishable drifts. And so every household became a kind of island, cut off from the rest. Those who had once shared gossip in the fields, or at market, now passed entire weeks without hearing another voice beyond their own kin. Loneliness wasn't an affliction, it was a certainty, and for the elderly it became a weight heavier than the snow on rooftops. Inside churches, candles burned low. The sermons, once filled with parables and grandeur, became shorter, simpler. Priests spoke of suffering as a test, of hardship as purification. Their words echoed in the cold stone halls, barely warming the faithful huddled in layers. Faith had become not a comfort, but a discipline. People prayed not with hope, but with obligation, because they had nothing left to try. For some, this was enough. For others, it was a bitter reminder that no divine hand had yet lifted the frost from their world. And yet, even amid this bleakness, life did not entirely retreat. In some households, the most surprising things endured. A father taught his daughter to play a reed flute made from a scrap of wood, not because there was celebration, but because sound reminded them that beauty could exist without sunshine. A mother told riddles, her voice cracking, her hands working thread as she spoke, fingers stiff from cold but determined to keep moving. Children made patterns in the frost on the window panes with their breath, leaving marks that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. Small moments, barely perceptible in the grand sweep of things, but they were everything. There were also those who wandered, not travellers in the usual sense, but the broken. Those who had lost family to fever or starvation, who no longer saw a reason to stay put. These souls roamed from village to village, cloaked in furs and desperation, knocking on doors in search of warmth or a bite to eat. Some were welcomed in, others were turned away. Not because of cruelty, but because there simply wasn't enough to go around. And in a world built on scarcity, kindness had to be measured like grain. Even the most generous heart sometimes faltered when faced with another empty bowl. As the weeks dragged on, people began to dream more vividly. Maybe it was the stillness, maybe the hunger, but dreams became realer, sharper. They spoke of warmth, of green fields, of tables filled with food. And when they awoke, the cruel contrast between dream and reality left some breathless. Yet no one spoke of this aloud. To speak too much of spring was to tempt fate. So they stored these visions in silence, carrying them like coals inside their chests, hidden but burning just enough to keep them going. In the larger towns, the wealthier had means to insulate themselves further. They employed others to chop wood, to sweep snow from paths, to guard against theft. Their homes, built from stone but lined with tapestries and heavy curtains, retained more heat. But even among them, winter's grip tightened. Illness spared no one. Cooks fell ill, children with delicate lungs coughed blood, old retainers who had served 3 generations took to their beds and never rose again. And the nobility, who once had the illusion of distance from common suffering, suddenly found themselves peers in misery, perhaps not in degree but in kind. The castle walls could not hold out the cold forever. In fact, they often made it worse. Those great stone fortresses soaked in winter's breath and exhaled it in chilling draughts. Fires burned in every room, but even the largest hearths couldn't warm the entire space. People gathered not in comfort but in proximity, clustered around the flame like moths too exhausted to fly. And servants, tired and underfed themselves, kept their silence and their tasks, knowing that one misstep could cost them more than just scolding. Occasionally there came word of worse things. Rumours travelling across the frozen land like the wind. Another village lost to illness. A monastery buried in snow. A noble's caravan ambushed by starving men who had nothing left to lose. Some whispered of wolves descending from the forests, drawn by the scent of death. Whether truth or exaggeration, these stories found root in minds already softened by cold and fear. People slept with knives beneath their pillows, not out of readiness for war, but as a final token of control in a world where nature held all the cards. Still, preparations began to shift. Not because winter had ended, but because its peak had passed. Beneath the snow, seeds stirred. Somewhere, barely perceptible, the angle of light had changed. Mothers looked to their children's clothes, calculating what could last another season. Fathers surveyed the tools, deciding which needed mending. Elders, whose bones felt the change of season before the sky ever showed it, began to speak of planting, of rains, of what needed to be done when the ground softened. It was not optimism exactly, it was habit, built over generations, a muscle memory of survival. When the first true thaw began, it didn't announce itself in grandeur. It came with dripping eaves, with puddles that refroze at night and melted again in the morning. Mud returned, sticky and clinging. The snow, once pristine, grew dirty and heavy, slouching in heaps beside roads and fields. But no one complained. The return of mud meant the world was waking. And though it came with wet feet and treacherous footing, it also came with the scent of earth, the first scent of the season that wasn't dry or dying. And that, more than any sermon or sign, told people that they had made it. The frost retreated inch by inch, and as it did, memories of winter became stories once more. The worst moments softened in the retelling. The near starvations became tales of cleverness. The days of silence were reframed as times of reflection. The despair that had threatened to take root now seemed distant, faded by the presence of birdsong and the first hints of green. They didn't celebrate loudly. There were no grand declarations, just the quiet work of rejoining the world. Oxen were brought out. Seeds were sorted. Wells were cleaned. Children were allowed to run again, their laughter feeling strange after so much silence. The living counted their numbers, honoured the missing, and turned their hands once more to the soil. And in all this, there was something greater than survival. There was legacy, because the medieval world didn't just endure winter. It folded winter into its identity. It remembered not just the hardships, but the ways people had responded to them, with sacrifice, with care, with strength, and those memories passed down not as warnings, but as reminders of what it meant to live fully, even in the hardest of times. ChatGPT said, "The fourth stretch of winter was often the cruelest, not because it brought the fiercest storms or the darkest days, but because it demanded the most patience. It was the part of the season when the body ached not just from cold, but from the weight of enduring it too long. The horizon still wore its white veil, but by now the snow no longer seemed majestic or new. It had turned to slush in some places, to filth in others, and yet refused to vanish altogether. And for the people who had already survived so much, this lingering grasp of winter was like a guest who had overstayed its welcome, one who refused to take a hint, who sat smugly in the corner as supplies dwindled and tempers shortened. It was during this time that even the most stalwart began to doubt. People who had braved nights without food or weeks without sunlight now stared blankly at doorways and windows, wondering how much longer they would have to hold on. What made this stage so treacherous wasn't the temperature or the snow, but the waiting, the endless monotony of frozen days, the unbearable repetition of scraping pots clean and praying the sun would warm the roof beams just a little more tomorrow than it did today. In the countryside, the barns were nearly empty. Where once there had been bales of hay stacked to the rafters and bins of grain tucked behind heavy wooden lids, there were now gaps, stark, yawning voids that told of just how much had been consumed. The livestock grew thinner. Their eyes, once bright and alert, now looked sunken, their movements slower. The milk from cows tasted faint and thin. Chickens laid fewer eggs, if any. The entire farm felt like it was suspended in a kind of quiet desperation, a long exhale with no breath left to draw back in. And yet work could not stop. Every day still demanded tasks. Firewood needed to be gathered, less for the warmth it offered than for the illusion of control. Chores became rituals. Fetch water, stoke the hearth, check the stores, even when everyone already knew there was nothing new to find. Repair broken tools with nothing but twine and prayers. Not because there was anything to fix right now, but because soon, hopefully soon, the thaw would come and they would need to be ready. Even as they struggled to feed themselves, they were preparing for the day when the world might finally give back. Inside the homes, families leaned even harder into each other. They shared everything now. Blankets, chores, grief. Children who once scampered and fought now sat quietly, folding scraps of cloth, turning spoon handles, watching for the tiniest changes. Elders told stories with less flair than before, their voices roughened by dry throats and long nights. But still the tales came, not to entertain, but to pass the hours, to remind everyone that once someone survived worse, and so they might too. In these moments, the essence of the season shifted. Winter was no longer an outside force to resist. It had become part of them. They no longer flinched at its touch. They simply accepted it, moved within it, made room for it. The sounds of the wind no longer frightened. The groans of the wooden beams in the night were familiar. Even the cracking ice in the distance felt more like a conversation than a threat. There was something strange about how easily fear could be replaced by weariness. At the beginning of the season, every cough brought dread. Every chill sparked anxiety. But now those same signs were met with a kind of fatalistic calm. People had seen too much, heard too many laments, buried too many friends. Grief had dulled into something quiet and persistent. Like the ache in one's back after lifting too much for too long, it didn't scream anymore. It just stayed. Occasionally the community would receive word of those who hadn't made it through. A neighbouring village, once a day's walk away, now only reached by brave messengers on half-starved horses, had lost half its families. Disease had swept through like a scythe. Or maybe it was hunger, or despair. No one ever knew for sure, because the lines between those three often blurred when the snow covered everything. It was hard to say what killed a man who hadn't eaten, hadn't warmed his bones, and hadn't spoken more than a dozen words in weeks. Was it fever? Was it frostbite? Or had winter simply worn him out from the inside? In towns, the poor gathered around church doors, hoping for one more crust of bread, one more cup of hot broth. Monks who had once chanted long, elaborate services now whispered shorter prayers between handing out what little food remained. Some monasteries had already emptied their larders, their generosity spent early in the season. Others were still rationing, knowing how many more days might remain before Green returned to the fields. But while the cold took its toll, it also revealed something else, something stronger than sorrow or pain. It brought forth a kind of courage that couldn't be measured in battle or speech. A mother giving her last heel of bread to her youngest child. A son rising early to cut ice from a frozen stream so his sick father could drink. A neighbour placing firewood beside someone else's door in the dark, not asking for thanks. These were acts that would not be recorded in books. There were no ballads sung for them, but they were the threads that kept the world from unravelling. There were also moments when the body simply refused to keep going. Some elders, sensing their strength fading, quietly removed themselves from the hearth, lying down in a corner and choosing not to rise again. No grand farewells, just a whisper, a sigh, and then stillness. Those left behind would bury them when the ground thawed. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd mark the spot, say a prayer, and keep going. Because there was no time for long mourning. The living still had to eat. The living still had to survive. Then came the water. Not the torrents of spring, not yet, but the first timid trickle of melting snow. A patch of roof that dripped into a bucket, the edges of a frozen pond turning glassy and uncertain. And with that sound came a shift. Eyes that had grown dull brightened slightly. Backs straightened. Hope, long dormant, stirred once more. It was fragile, tentative, but it was bold real. This hope did not come with songs or dancing, it came with action. The youngest was sent to check on the livestock. The strongest tested the trails to neighbouring homes. Tools were brought out again, not as ritual but as purpose. A frozen field was inspected. A broken fence was noted. There was work to do. Not just the daily grind of surviving, but the glorious, exhausting labour of returning to life. Carts were uncovered. Harnesses were checked. Seeds, stored and guarded with near-religious devotion all winter, were brought to the table. They were counted, inspected, divided. Some were rotted, some had sprouted too early, but enough remained, enough to begin again. And this was the real miracle of the season. Not that the cold ended, but that people still had the strength to begin once it did. That they hadn't just endured for endurance's sake, but had kept some small part of themselves unbroken. A seed within, like those in their sacks, waiting for the right moment to open again. When the first furrow was cut into thawed ground, it was not just a farming act, it was a ritual. A declaration. We are still here. The plough bit into the dirt like a knife through a wound that had finally scabbed over. It was messy, difficult, slow, but it was forward movement. Children watched with wide eyes. The old wiped tears from weathered cheeks. The animals, sluggish and rib-thin, moved as best they could. Everyone gave what they had. The sun lingered just a little longer each evening. Birds returned with songs hesitant at first, then bold. The first blades of green peeked from the earth. The people, so long bent and silent, stood a little taller, spoke a little louder. The world was waking up, and so were they. But they did not forget. They carried winter with them always, not in fear but in memory. It became part of how they measured time, how they judged worth, how they raised their children. They taught not only how to sow and reap, but how to wait, how to endure, how to give even when there is nothing left. And they told stories. Not just of kings and wars and saints, but of the winter when the soup ran thin and the laughter thinner, and yet the family stayed warm around the fire. Of the neighbour who shared their last candle. Of the moment when frost gave way to bloom, and the world impossibly continued. The fifth passage through winter's long shadow was not met with drama or fanfare. It unfolded with the quiet persistence of breath, each one fogging the air with reminders that life had not yet yielded. This final stretch, this lingering end of the season's grasp, was deceptive in its calm. The fiercest storms had passed, the deepest cold had waned, but the land remained gripped by silence, as if nature itself had been humbled by the ordeal. And those who had made it through, the villagers with gaunt cheeks, the children grown thinner and quieter, the elderly wrapped in threadbare wool and weary eyes, now stood on the edge of recovery with the reluctant caution of people who had learned not to trust too soon. By now, most fires were no longer crackling with confidence. Woodpiles that had once seemed plentiful were down to damp scraps and broken branches. Men spent more time searching for kindling than warming themselves, and children learned quickly which trees to avoid and which ones to strip. The forest, once teeming with the rustle of birds and the chorus of insects, was a hushed cathedral of bare limbs and ice-polished stones. Every step taken into the woods was one measured against risk. Would a branch break? Would the cold bite too deep? Would the silence break into something unwelcome? And still, life did not stop. The mothers continued to stir thin pots of pottage, boiling bones until they cracked, coaxing flavour from rind and root. Fathers repaired tools with hands so cracked and rough they bled without pain. Grandmothers still reached for thread and needle, weaving repairs into clothing that had already been patched a dozen times. And the youngest, the children born just before the frost or during its cruelest hours, watched it all, absorbing the movements, the silence, the resilience like language. They knew nothing else, and yet they understood more about life than many scholars ever would. In the wealthier homes, the transition was easier, but not without its own weight. The nobleman's stew pot was fuller, but it still boiled with more caution than grandeur. The castle walls, now streaked with moisture from thawing ice, echoed with the creaks of servants and the muffled voices of worry. Even lords and ladies, surrounded by servants and bolstered by stored food, spoke in hushed tones. Their comfort could delay suffering, but not deny it. Illness still visited their halls. Grief still lingered at the corners of feasting tables. Even the most powerful among them had begun to feel the cold not as an enemy to outlast, but as a mirror held up to their own limitations. And then came the melt, not swift, not immediate, but unmistakable. It arrived first in puddles that lingered through the night without turning to ice. Then in the heavy drip of snow slipping from thatched roofs. The ground, long frozen and unyielding, began to soften, exhaling the damp scent of rot and rebirth. The people stepped out slowly, cautiously, like prisoners testing the gate of a cell left ajar. They did not cheer. They watched. They waited. In the fields, the first shoots were more rumour than plant, but they were enough. Even a blade of grass, pale and trembling against the wind, sparked a shift in the hearts of those who had endured. There was still hunger. There was still cold, but the balance had shifted. Life was no longer hiding. It was reaching again, curling out of the soil with tentative hope, and with it came purpose. Men took to the fields with ploughs still scarred from last season. Oxen moved slow, ribs still visible, but they moved. The earth resisted at first, compacted and wounded from the long siege of snow. But soon, with each furrow turned, the land seemed to remember its function. Seeds were scattered with reverence, as if they were prayers laid gently into the wounds of the earth. Women opened windows that had remained shuttered for months. The air that rushed in was not yet warm, but it smelled different. Less like death, more like becoming. Babies were brought out, wrapped tightly, shown the world for the first time not through a haze of frost, but beneath a pale, honest sun. Elders sat on benches warmed by the slightest rays, their faces tilted upward in stillness, not asleep but remembering. In the churches, songs returned to the halls not as solemn chants, but as quiet hymns of gratitude. The candles burned longer now, not because they were needed for warmth, but because people chose to linger, to sit, to reflect, to feel. The prayers were softer, the hands folded in them less clenched. Gratitude bloomed like the crocuses at the chapel doors, tender, trembling, brave. But perhaps the most telling sign of winter's departure was not the melt or the plough or even the bloom. It was the stories. They returned, around fires that crackled with fresh wood, not soaked remnants, at tables where bread, though still coarse, came with a little honey, a little salt. Neighbours, once too burdened to speak, began to share again. Tales of the coldest night, the baby who didn't wake, the stranger who brought firewood, the girl who sang when everyone else had fallen silent. These were not just stories, they were foundations, pillars upon which the next season would be built. Children played again, not cautiously, but with wildness. Their boots splashed in thawed puddles, their laughter echoing across fields still half dead from snow. They chased birds, rolled in mud, threw stones into ditches now rushing with melted ice. Their cheeks flushed not from fever, but from energy, from life. They would remember little of the darkest days, but they would carry forward the strength of those who raised them through it. And for the old, this transition was perhaps the most sacred. They had seen more winters than most, and each one had taken a toll. A spouse, a friend, a child, a part of themselves. They did not fear death. They feared leaving behind those unprepared for the next frost. And so, as spring crept into their bones, they passed on what they could. Not just knowledge of planting or mending, but of patience, of silence, of when to fight and when to endure, of how to find grace in a world that did not always give it freely. And so it was that winter finally stepped back. Not defeated, not banished, but honoured. It had served its purpose. It had tested the people, pruned the weak branches, exposed the cracks in homes and hearts alike. But it had also revealed strength. Not the kind sung about by bards or written into royal scrolls, but the quiet, unshakable kind that burns low and steady. The kind found in mothers who shared the last spoonful, in fathers who kept walking, in neighbours who knocked, even when their own cupboards were bare. The medieval world did not emerge from winter unscarred. It carried the season's mark deep in its bones, but it carried too the memory of endurance, of flickering flames kept alive through sheer will, of fields turned anew, of songs hummed when words failed, of the promise that no matter how long the night, The sun was always waiting. The sixth passage through the medieval winter's lingering tale was neither dramatic nor sudden. It unfolded like a slow breath, returning to lungs that had forgotten how to inhale fully. Spring had not yet arrived, but winter's authority had been quietly undermined. The cold no longer roared, it mumbled. The wind no longer whipped with fury, it brushed past like a weary traveller moving on. And in this in-between space a hush settled over the villages, not of fear or silence, but of cautious reconstruction, of life gently, slowly beginning again. By now, the heaviest cloaks were worn thin, not from lack of care, but from relentless use. Wool had been stretched, mended, patched, and worn again until it held more history than fabric. Boots were softened from snow and soaked in mud, and yet they carried their wearers through another day. Mittens stitched by firelight during the longest nights were traded down from elder to child, from sibling to sibling, so no hand was left bare against the still-tempered wind. These garments were not merely clothing, they were evidence, tangible proof that those who wore them had endured the worst the world could conjure. The soil, for the first time in months, began to yield to pressure. Where once it had defied every footstep with its iron grip, it now gave way softly, sucking at boots, clinging to wheels, signalling its readiness to become something more than frozen memory. The peasants noticed first, not with cheers but with a renewed rhythm in their movements. They stooped with more purpose, checked the furrows they had dug in anticipation, and pressed seeds into earth that still felt too stubborn but no longer hopeless. Life moved from hearthside to fields with a kind of spiritual migration. Those who had survived the winter carried their stories with them. Quiet, internal monologues etched behind their eyes. A man might pause mid-plough to glance at the sky, not for signs of weather, but for the absence of that old shadow that had hung there all season. A mother might cradle a newborn and stare at the baby's breath, no longer fearing that it would still in the night. They were beginning to live without watching for death's approach at every corner. Church bells rang differently now, not louder, but clearer. The sound travelled over damp fields and stirred more than worship. It stirred movement. Weddings were planned again. Baptisms resumed. Offerings placed at altars included more than desperate prayers. They now held thanks. Priests, gaunt from long seasons of sacrifice, stood taller, their words more certain. They did not claim the victory over the cold. They acknowledged it, honoured it, and guided their congregations forward, one cautious hymn at a time. Markets began to stir. No longer just trading preserved roots and dried fish, they welcomed spring with bundles of foraged greens, nettles, wild garlic, sorrel, plucked carefully from places where sunlight had returned. Hunters arrived with lean rabbits and fresh pelts. Fishermen dared rivers that had finally begun to flow again, casting lines and nets with a renewed hunger, not just for food but for action. Trade routes, long abandoned under heaps of snow and ice, were tested again. Horses, hesitant but obedient, pulled carts through roads still half frozen, half mud. Inside the homes, windows were unshuttered more frequently. Not wide and not for long, but just enough to let in air that no longer bit the lungs. Thatched roofs dripped steadily, their icy crowns melting into rivulets. Buckets were set below leaks not to catch despair, but to mark the changing of the season. Floors were swept more often now, not to push away soot or ash, but to prepare, to cleanse the remnants of a long, dark fight and make room for what would come next. But winter had not passed without consequence. Graves dotted the hillsides, some marked, many not. Wooden crosses stood tilted in softened ground, names etched hastily, if at all. Families were smaller. Some cottages remained empty, doors slightly ajar, never closed since the last soul had left them. Villagers passed by these places with quiet nods or soft gestures, acknowledgements without words. They carried those absences like stones in their pockets, never shown, always felt, and yet, among the mourning, joy began to take root again. A child's first steps across a yard no longer covered in snow drew smiles from all who saw. A man discovered last year's apple tree had survived the frost and bloomed with tentative blossoms. A woman found that her bees had made it through the cold, buzzing again inside a hive once thought abandoned. These moments were not rare, they were sacred. Each small return was cherished not just for what it was, but for what it signalled. Life, having been paused, had chosen to continue. The nobles too emerged from their stone sanctuaries, stepping onto terraces and castle courtyards with tentative relief. Their feasts returned. albeit with smaller portions and fewer guests. Servants no longer shuffled with slumped shoulders, they moved with the energy of those who knew their service mattered again. Tapestries were taken down, beaten of soot and rehung, flags were unfurled. Music returned to banquet halls, first in whispers, harps plucked softly, flutes humming, melodies once stilled, and then in crescendos, echoing down corridors that had known only silence. Celebrations began to reappear, not grand, but earnest. The Feast of Plough. Monday, long prepared for in whispers, became the first gathering that felt like promise. Villagers paraded their ploughs through town, some decorated with scraps of ribbon, others with flowers forced to bloom in warm corners of cottages. Laughter rang through the chill like thawed wine pouring from a jug, loosening the ache in every chest. Faces painted with soot. Children danced in circles, mothers clapped their hands, and even the old joined in, stomping stiff boots into softened soil as if challenging the earth to deny them another season. And love, long silent, crept out of the cold. Letters were exchanged, bans were posted. A young man proposed with a single wildflower found among the thaw, and his bride-to-be wept, not from romance, but from the sheer beauty of something living offered after so many weeks of dying. Hands joined, songs were sung again, not in mourning but in courtship, and for the first time in many months, laughter returned to doorsteps without needing apology. Stories were no longer just tools for distraction. They became threads again, woven into daily speech, binding neighbours in shared memory. The tale of the boy who walked 2 villages over with a sled of firewood, the old widow who cooked for the sick even after she'd buried her husband, the priest who opened the chapel for shelter when the storm buried half the town. These became legends, not mythical but heroic in a way only real suffering can carve. But even as the thaw progressed, people did not forget caution. The snow might have melted from the roads, but it still clung to the mountains. The air still bit after sundown. Illness still lingered in weakened lungs. The memory of hunger did not fade with the return of food. Bread, when it came warm from the hearth again, was broken with reverence. Meat was chewed slowly. Even joy was consumed carefully, as if to preserve its taste. Nobody wanted to forget what it cost to survive, and perhaps that was the winter's final gift, its brutal, frost-bitten lesson. Not the pain, but the clarity. People knew now what mattered. A shared loaf, a warm room, a single voice in the silence. They had seen the very edge of human frailty, and they had looked back from it, not with arrogance, but with grace. They had found in themselves the stubborn thread of hope, thin as it was, and they had followed it through the dark. And so the medieval world turned its face toward the sun once more, not with blind relief, but with solemn determination. For they knew another winter would come, another season would test them, and when it did, they would gather wood again, preserve food again, whisper prayers again, not because they feared the cold, but because they respected it, because they had learned that while spring may save, it is winter that teaches. The 7th breath of the waning winter arrived not as an event, but as a gradual easing, like the turning of a tide so slow it could only be noticed in hindsight. No one could pinpoint the exact day it happened, but the signs were unmistakable. Smoke from chimneys curled higher into the sky as if suddenly unburdened. The silence that had wrapped the landscape for months began to lift, replaced by the distant trickle of water, the first footsteps on thawed ground, and the hesitant return of birdsong. For the people of the medieval countryside, this soft shift wasn't a cue for celebration, it was a summons, a call to rise from stillness and prepare for the next test, rebuilding. The harshest season had taken its toll. Along roads barely cleared of their last coat of frost, travellers now appeared, not traders or nobles, but villagers from hamlets nearby, checking on distant kin, delivering long-delayed news, or simply seeking a reason to leave the house that had become a prison. The greetings were quiet, respectful, touched with the solemnity of people who understood what it meant to have survived when others hadn't. Hugs were exchanged not for comfort, but for confirmation, you're still here, and so am I. In the fields, the thaw revealed the bones of what had once been routine. Wooden fence posts snapped under the weight of months of snow. Tools left leaning against walls, now rusted or cracked. Seed sacks that had been guarded like gold now sat in the open again, ready to be portioned out. Each handful was not just a measure of future food, it was a wager against fate. If frost returned too soon, the loss would be immense, but to delay planting would invite hunger come summer. And so the peasants sowed their rows under a sky still edged in grey, each gesture one part necessity, one part defiance. Not all signs of return were agricultural. Inside the villages, thresholds that had been crossed in sorrow now saw more frequent footsteps. A young woman opened her shutters and began sweeping her doorstep daily, not out of cleanliness but out of habit, the kind of habit that says, "I still believe this home will welcome guests again." An old man dragged his stool outside to sit beneath the eaves, nodding at passers-by, his presence a declaration that time had not claimed him. Children, at first timid in their play, began to chase each other again, shrieking not in fear or cold but in delight, their boots slapping mud and puddles with a rhythm older than memory. The returning of life wasn't loud. It wasn't even joyful at first. It was deliberate, measured, as if the people themselves understood they had walked through something cruel, and to rejoin the world too quickly would dishonour it. Laughter came, but in quiet bursts. Songs were hummed, but not yet sung aloud. Lovers held hands, but often still with gloves on. Even in the castles, where thick walls had protected nobility from the worst of the season, the change was palpable. Servants cleaned hearths not out of urgency, but in readiness. Cooks prepared soups with foraged greens, marvelling at the colour. Horses, once blanketed and hidden in stables, were led blinking into the light. The lords and ladies held council again, not about rationing or disease, but about harvest, about taxes, about roads in need of repair. Life, even in privilege, had been stalled, and now it moved again, slowly, like thawing sap rising in trees. The church, which had offered its sanctuaries to the desperate all winter long, began to shift its role once more. Monks returned to copying texts and tilling their own gardens. Bells were rung not for funerals, but for weddings. Baptisms surged, not because there were so many newborns, but because so many had waited until the worst was over to risk such a sacred gathering. Faith had survived the cold, though not untouched. Where once the people had prayed for mercy, now they prayed in gratitude and in remembrance. This was also the season of reckoning. The first real warmth brought with it the unearthing of what the cold had concealed. Some homes were found collapsed. Others stood shielded, their inhabitants gone. Graves were dug for those who had died during the freeze but could not be properly buried until now. Priests and villagers alike performed final rites with cracked voices, whispering names lost in the long dark. The ground was soft enough to dig in, and it drank the tears of the living as if to make amends. And yet even among mourning, resilience showed its face. A widow who had lost her husband that winter began baking again. Not lavish meals, just simple bread, dense and dark. But she gave some away, a slice here, a half loaf there. A smith whose tools had frozen into rust spent his days grinding, sharpening, mending, offering his labour to others before asking for payment. These acts were not charity, they were community. Not grand gestures, but stitches in the fabric of survival. Stories began to change too. No longer only accounts of death or endurance, they shifted into tales of courage. The girl who walked 2 leagues through snow to fetch medicine, the boy who trapped enough rabbits to feed his whole family, the old couple who shared their last blanket with a stranger, and somehow all 3 survived. These weren't legends, they were memories, turned noble by the mere fact that someone had chosen kindness in the face of despair. Children listened wide-eyed, not yet understanding the full weight of what they heard, but sensing that these were not ordinary stories. They would repeat them one day, adding their own embellishments, crafting a narrative not just of hardship but of the triumph hidden in persistence. And perhaps that was the quiet miracle of that 7th stretch of winter's end. Not the thaw, not the green shoots, but the human instinct to transform pain into meaning. Even the land bore scars. Fields once planned with precision were now uneven, pocked with frostbite. Roads had eroded, streams had changed course. The wilderness encroached in places it hadn't before. But the people did not see this as ruin. They saw it as a challenge. What had been broken could be rebuilt. What had been taken might be replanted. And so they started again, not with the careless hope of those untouched by suffering, but with the informed courage of survivors who know just how fragile everything can be, and how fiercely it must be protected. The first feast held after winter's retreat was never extravagant. It might be nothing more than a communal stew, shared in wooden bowls passed hand to hand, but it carried more meaning than the grandest banquet. Each person who sat down to eat knew that their presence was not guaranteed, that their hunger was not inevitable, that the food before them, however modest, was sacred. The toast raised that day wasn't to kings or saints, it was to each other, to the neighbour who gave, the stranger who stayed, the child who endured. It was to the memory of those who didn't make it, and the strength of those who did. And though the toast may not have been spoken in formal words, it rang out in every lifted spoon, every shared smile, every hand clasped in silent recognition. And so, the medieval world began again. Not fresh, not unscarred, but alive. It rebuilt not in defiance of the winter, but because of it. Because every gust of wind, every night without fire, every meal missed, had taught a lesson too deep to be unlearned, that humanity, when stripped to its core, still chooses to love, to create, to grow. ChatGPT said, "The eighth step beyond winter's grasp was not merely a moment of change. It was a shift in rhythm, a return to pulse. What had been frozen and brittle now softened underfoot. Earth that once defied the spade began to welcome it, and the world no longer felt like a place to survive, but a place to shape again." The people, having passed through a season that demanded every ounce of endurance, now began the task of restoring what had been weathered by cold, grief and hunger. Morning no longer crept over the hills like a thief. It arrived earlier now, slipping over rooftops and through narrow alleys with a light that didn't blind, but gently warmed. That light fell upon faces that had thinned during the long months but still looked upward. Sleep no longer served as an escape from freezing nights. It became rest in its truest form. The kind that repairs and renews, not the kind that merely delays collapse. The air smelled different. The wind, though still chilled, carried with it the scent of wet soil, the musk of waking roots, and the faintest trace of something green not yet seen. People noticed it, this change. A woman paused while fetching water to breathe it in. A child stopped mid-game to look at a tree's bare branch and whisper a question. "When will you grow again?" The markets, once empty but for dried beans and brittle goods, slowly became places of exchange again. Not yet brimming, but alive. Wool was traded not for coin, but for eggs. A smoked trout passed from hand to hand, not as payment, but as gratitude. These exchanges didn't merely revive the economy, they revived trust. They proved that beneath the survival instinct, generosity still pulsed like sap in a thawing trunk. Village greens, silent under frost, now echoed with the sounds of cautious activity. Farmers shared tales while mending tools in the sun. A blacksmith, having kept his forge quiet all season to conserve fuel, now let his bellows roar again. The ringing of metal upon metal was not just the return of craft, it was the sound of a people remembering who they were when they weren't just trying to stay alive. This return to life came slowly, like a melody remembered one note at a time. The songs sung to infants returned first, whispered by mothers who hadn't dared sing all winter. Then came the lullabies hummed over the loaves of bread and morning chores. And finally full voices lifted together in taverns and fields, not in chorus but in scattered phrases, like seeds scattered into freshly turned soil. Young couples whose courtship had paused beneath the burden of scarcity found moments to smile again. A boy carved a flute from fresh wood and played by the creek, not for attention but for the sheer joy of creating sound that wasn't wind or weeping. A girl wove the first daisies into her hair, even though they were few and small. These small choices, to adorn, to play, to flirt, were not frivolous. They were the declarations of a people who had not been extinguished. The old took longer to return. They moved slowly through these days, carrying with them not just the stiffness of age, but the solemn knowledge of how close they'd come to disappearing. Their words came measured, each conversation a ledger of who was still here and who was not. But even they began to smile, not out of amusement but out of relief. Each new sunrise felt like something earned, not granted. Each warm afternoon like a privilege. Monasteries, quiet sanctuaries during the coldest months, returned to their broader duties. Monks harvested early herbs, distributed tinctures, and opened the scriptoriums again. The work of copying texts, paused in the worst of winter due to frostbitten fingers and darkened halls, resumed with a reverence born of renewed purpose. Knowledge, once frozen between pages, now flowed again in ink and ink-stained hands. In the highlands and along the moors, shepherds brought their flocks from shelter. The sheep, scraggly and mud-slick, bleated at the sudden light. Lambs were born, a symbol more potent than any relic. They arrived into a world still chilled but softening, their legs wobbly, their cries high-pitched, yet unmistakably alive. Those who saw them did not cheer. They knelt. They understood. Food remained scarce, but meals changed. Where once there was only porridge or boiled bones, now there were sprigs of wild onion, fresh watercress, an egg stolen warm from a hen's nesting place. These flavours were sharp, not sweet, but they cut through the palate like truth. And after months of dull sameness, truth was a feast. Communal labour blossomed, walls were rebuilt, fields shared, roofs patched. A family who had lost their father to frost was helped by others without need for request. Not out of charity, but memory, because everyone knew how close they had come to becoming that family, and no one wanted to pretend they'd survived by luck alone. The village's strength, always rooted in shared burden, now revealed itself in shared action. There were still days when the frost returned, still nights when a wind howled with echoes of December, but no longer did it command the same fear. People no longer bowed to the cold, they acknowledged it, gave it a place. Like one might allow a difficult guest to sit by the fire, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what had been endured. Even art returned. A young man carved images into wooden beams newly exposed from snow, not saints or soldiers, but animals, faces, swirling vines. A girl painted her doorframe with berries, staining it red despite her mother's protest. Old songs were repurposed with new words. Dances once lost to fear began again, awkwardly, with missteps and laughter. Culture, once frozen, now thawed, moved again through bodies and breath. Children born in the coldest months were now strong enough to be named. Ceremonies were held in the open air, the infants held up to the sun, as if offering them to the sky itself. The names given were not chosen lightly. They were not poetic or fashionable. They were strong, old names, names that had survived. The rivers swelled with melted snow, rushing faster than anyone expected. With them came silt, debris, fish, and the people stood on bridges and banks, watching this water, this force that had once been ice and stillness, now crashed through the land like a declaration. It reminded them that nature was not just capable of taking, but also of giving back. And as they watched, they wept. Not for sorrow, but for sheer relief. They knew now what the cold had taught, that peace is not stillness, and safety is not silence, that to endure is not to merely exist, but to remember that after everything is stripped away, there is still will, still connection, still something beneath the hunger and fear that says, I will go on. And so they did. They tilled, they sang, they held hands, they carried one another's burdens not because they had to, but because they had chosen to be more than what the winter had tried to make of them. They had tasted the edge of nothingness and turned back with their dignity intact. No kings wrote of them, no books immortalized them, but in the way they rebuilt, quietly, honestly, they reshaped the world. The ninth stretch into life after the cold was marked not by a single gesture, but by thousands of small ones, each almost invisible on its own, but together forming a quiet revolution against despair. The land, so recently frozen into submission, now yielded without resistance, and the people, those who had stared into the hollow eyes of winter and did not blink, responded not with fanfare, but with work. With hands that had gone numb or to something they could count, they returned to the soil, to the hearth, to each other, not with celebration but with reverence, because they knew something most would never understand. To survive is not merely to persist, it is to refuse to vanish. Each village was a tapestry of motion now, but not one born of chaos. These were purposeful steps, tasks woven back into daily rhythm, routines pulled from Maon or from memory, like old cloaks and worn again with care. The bakery, which had gone silent for months, now sent out the warm scent of yeast and smoke. The mill creaked back to life as the river's thawed current turned its wheel once more, its rhythmic groan echoing like a heartbeat down the valley. And in every cottage, doors were left cracked open, not for ventilation, but as a quiet invitation, a sign that fear had stepped aside. The children, more resilient than anyone gave them credit for, adapted the fastest. Though their bones were thinner and their faces paler than the previous autumn, their eyes were alight with that invincible hunger to play. Mud became their canvas, sticks their swords bow, and laughter their defiance. They chased each other through thawing fields, past the graves that were still too fresh, too many, yet no longer the centre of every day. Their joy was not naive. It was a reclamation, a declaration that the world still belonged to them. The elders moved differently. With each footstep they took, they seemed to weigh it against memory. Every patch of moss that survived the cold, every stream that sang again, was a reminder that nature had not betrayed them. It had merely withdrawn. Now, as it unfolded once more, they watched not with expectation but with awe. They understood better than most that nothing owed them anything. Every bloom, every green shoot, was a gift. In the forest, life was louder. Branches no longer creaked under ice but swayed freely, their bark shedding old frost like a snake sloughing its skin. Birds returned first, calling out songs half-remembered from the fall. Then came the small animals, emerging from hollows, blinking in the soft light. Hunters moved quietly, not with greed, but with deep respect. Every catch was seen as grace, every missed arrow as fair. No one hunted more than they needed, and the forest in turn seemed to allow it. Even the wind had changed. Once it howled with menace, tearing through cracks in stone and wood. Now it danced, whispering instead of wailing, brushing faces with cool encouragement. The people no longer pulled their cloaks tighter when it passed. They lifted their chins, breathed it in, and let it tell them the season had truly turned. In town squares, benches were repaired. Fires were built not just for heat, but for gathering. People sat shoulder to shoulder again. They spoke not in panicked murmurs, but in steady voices. Plans were made, fences needed rebuilding, irrigation ditches needed clearing. The travelling merchant might return by month's end. Someone's cousin was coming to visit. The old woman with the limp had taken in 2 orphans. The shoemaker had extra leather. These weren't just conversations. They were the stitching of a torn community. But not all work was physical. Within the soul, too, there was rebuilding. Men who had wept in secret now sang while working. Women who had watched their larders dwindle to crumbs now shared pickled roots and dried herbs without being asked. Grudges born from hardship were quietly set down. A feud over a pig, a quarrel over firewood, these things dissolved under the weight of shared survival. No one said the words, but all knew, we have been through too much to waste our days in bitterness. The priests too changed. They stood in pulpits not as authorities, but as fellow survivors. Their sermons spoke less of punishment and more of resilience. They no longer preached fire and judgment, but endurance and grace. Their eyes, sunken and red from months of funerals and fasting, now sought signs of hope in every bowed head. They no longer demanded faith, they offered it. There were still shadows, of course. Some homes would never be repaired, some wounds would not close. There were families whose laughter would not return for many seasons. There were men who spoke less and drank more. Women who woke screaming from dreams they couldn't explain. Trauma lingered like frost in shaded corners, thinner but still biting, and no one pretended otherwise. Yet even in that there was progress. A neighbour would leave food on a doorstep. A child would fetch water for the man who couldn't bring himself to go to the river. A widow would hum to herself while mending clothes, not for a husband now gone, but for the children of another. Compassion, once rationed, was now spent freely. And something unexpected returned with the warmth, curiosity. After so many months of shrinking inwards, people looked outward. They noticed things again, the colour of bark, the shape of clouds, the sound of bees. A young girl asked her mother why moss only grew on one side of a tree. The boy followed ants for an hour, fascinated by their endless trail. Curiosity was the first step to joy, and joy, the quiet kind, was the first step to living again, not just surviving. The earth, scarred but awake, responded. Crops sprouted in lines drawn by tired but determined hands. Herbs sprang from the edges of gardens. Even the weeds, once hated, were welcomed, proof that the world still had vigour. Rain came not as sleet or misery, but as life. It soaked the ground and was met with gratitude, not groans. People lifted their faces to it. They did not run, and for those who had lost everything, those whose homes had collapsed, whose kin were gone, the village gathered. They built shelters, they donated goats, they shared seeds. There was no ceremony, no decree, it was simply done. Because after a season where every meal had been shared and every fire had been huddled around by many, no one remembered how to go back to selfishness. The stories passed down now included not just sorrow but honour. A child would hear of how their uncle carried an old man 3 miles through the snow. A woman would be told how her mother kept singing lullabies when her fingers were too frozen to move. These were not exaggerations, they were truth. And they were repeated not to glorify suffering, but to ensure it was never taken lightly. The rhythms of spring returned in full. The festival of planting, though smaller than in past years, was still held. People danced barefoot in the mud, not because it was easy, but because it meant they could. Children wore flower crowns, men roasted rabbits over open fires, women strung garlands along doorways. It wasn't lavish, but it was sacred. Every shared smile, every full belly, every hand held in dance was a celebration not just of the season, but of the fact that the season had come at all. And in the evenings, as the sun finally lingered again, people sat outside longer. They did not speak of everything they had seen. Some things remained unspoken, but they sat close and they listened to the crickets, and they watched the stars blink into the sky like promises, and they knew that though winter would come again, they would meet it not with fear, but with memory. They had been through the darkest months together, and now as they wove the threads of their lives back into shape, they understood something deeper than any written text, deeper than any royal decree or holy sermon, that the heart of a people does not beat through comfort or wealth. It beats in the act of continuing, of refusing to end. The 10th stride forward into the quiet wake of winter's retreat was marked not by noise, not by any grand procession of springtime splendour, but by the delicate persistence of daily life. The frost had lifted, yes, and the soil had softened, but it was not the return of warmth alone that made this moment significant. It was the resilience woven into the fabric of every motion, every breath, every choice made without fanfare. The people did not march into the season ahead. They pressed into it, steady and deliberate, like tree roots spreading slowly but with certainty. A traveller passing through one of these villages might not have recognised the weight of what had been endured. They would see doors propped open again, smoke curling peacefully from chimneys, children skipping along muddy lanes. But behind each gesture lay memory of hunger's shadow, of illness that came without warning, of nights where no fire could thaw what had frozen inside. The healing wasn't visible like flowers pushing through dirt. It lived in how they moved, how they held one another's gaze a beat longer than before, how they gave space for silence when there were no words to say. Fields that once lay beneath a silent shroud of ice now echoed with the thud of wooden tools against earth. Men and women, their hands chapped and scarred from the long fight against the cold, now turned that same endurance toward cultivation. Every furrow carved was an act of faith. Seeds were pressed into the ground not with casual expectation, but with reverent hope. It was a kind of prayer in motion, no longer whispered toward the heavens, but whispered into the soil, into the rhythm of labour. The animals had changed too. Livestock that had survived emerged thinner, warier, but no less vital. Hens resumed their laying, hesitant at first but gaining pace. Goats and sheep, long sheltered, now grazed with a kind of tentative freedom, their hooves sinking into a landscape that no longer bit back. The shepherds, quiet and watchful, greeted them each morning as if greeting an old friend who had nearly been lost. These creatures weren't just property, they were continuity. They represented the thread that had not been severed, the proof that life had not altogether withdrawn. Not all villages had recovered equally. Some bore heavier scars. In these places, the buildings stood at odd angles, wood swollen from months of snow, walls split at the seams. The repairs came slowly. No one had the strength for speed, but they had the will for consistency. A roof was patched, a broken wheel was mended, a fence post was reset. Not all at once, but piece by piece, and each act, however small, was witnessed by others. No one rebuilt alone, not anymore. There were evenings now that held a hush, not of fear, but of rest. People sat beside one another again. They didn't speak of their losses. Some wounds were still too raw, but they spoke of what came next. The grain they hoped to harvest, the next festival, however modest, a neighbour's new baby, a recovered well. They spoke these things with a kind of fragile gladness, as though the words themselves might crack if spoken too loudly. But they spoke them, and that alone was a kind of rebirth. In the heart of many communities, the communal oven fired up once again. not just for baking, but for gathering. People came not only with their dough, but with stories, with questions, with offerings. A woman might bring a bit of garlic she'd managed to dry, not for trade but to share. A man might offer dried berries he had hidden away for a moment like this. These were not acts of commerce, they were rituals of belonging. The fire that baked the bread also warmed their bonds, and as loaves emerged golden from the ash, something deeper was kindled, a belief that they had more to give than they'd feared. There were still shortages, still days when the pantry was nearly empty, still nights when the cold returned, biting at the ankles, creeping through cracks in windows. But now, no one suffered alone. If a family went without, another sent a portion. If someone fell ill, others took shifts tending their fire, watching their children. It was not charity, it was the truth of living after loss. Once you've known isolation that deep, you never again let someone drown without reaching out your hand. Children were growing again, not just taller, but louder, more curious. They asked about the sky, about the stars that returned each night like watchful guardians. They asked where snow came from and why it vanished. And the adults, though tired, answered patiently. Because these were the kinds of questions only children could ask. Questions unburdened by dread. And to answer them was to declare again and again that tomorrow still existed. The skies changed. The harsh grey was replaced by a shifting tapestry of blue and silver, of clouds that promised rain rather than storm. Rain meant life now, not trouble. When it fell, people stood in it without flinching. They watched it bead on leaves, soak into the earth, drip from eaves like music. It was not a threat, it was a gift. Even when it turned the roads to mud and filled the ditches to overflowing, it was accepted. Because it did not freeze, because it did not kill. Priests gave fewer funerals now and more blessings. More weddings too. People didn't wait anymore. Life was too uncertain to delay joy. Couples bound themselves together with flowers and thread, no matter how meagre the ceremony. The vows meant more now. When they spoke of for better or worse, they knew what worse looked like, and that knowledge gave their promises a gravity no fine silk or golden ring ever could. And music returned. Faint at first. A man with a fiddle playing to himself as he walked home. A child tapping rhythms on a pot. A song remembered by an elder, hummed into a quiet room. These sounds, once silenced by the wind, now returned as defiance. Each note said, "I am still here. I still remember how to create. I still dare to feel joy." There were gatherings, too. Not always planned, not always large, but real. People sat around fires and passed cups of weak ale or warm milk and talked. Not about kings or battles or the politics of the realm, but about the squirrel seen in the trees, the sheep that gave twins, the flower blooming early behind someone's home. These small things had become their treasures. They clung to them not out of ignorance, but out of deep understanding. These moments, simple, fleeting, were the marrow of life. And slowly they began to plan again. Not just for the next day, but for the next season. Someone suggested building a new granary stronger than before. Another spoke of digging a communal well to avoid past mistakes. Someone else began crafting a calendar, marking feasts and fasts with charcoal and ink. It wasn't ambition, it was preparation. It was the wisdom learned from nearly losing everything. They still remembered those who hadn't made it. Each home had its absences, a chair that remained empty, a name never said aloud, a door that never opened again. But those memories weren't hidden away. They were folded into daily life like a familiar scent, always present. They didn't mourn in ceremony anymore. They mourned in how they lived, with tenderness, with slowness, with purpose. And so the world turned. The days grew longer. The ground grew firmer. The hearts, once clenched in dread, softened. The people of this quiet, battered land didn't rebuild because they believed they could return to what once was. They rebuilt because they knew what was worth saving. Not everything had survived the frost, but the will to continue had, and that was enough. The 11th return of daylight after winter's long rain was not met with loud voices or bold banners. No horn was sounded to mark it, yet its presence was undeniable. It arrived in the faint warmth on the side of a barn wall, in the sudden appearance of wild violets at the base of a crumbling fence, in the way people stepped outside not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The season no longer held them hostage. And in this subtle shift, the world began again. The very soil beneath their feet, once clenched tight in an icy grip, had loosened its fingers. The earth gave a little now. Footsteps made soft impressions instead of cracking frost. Bare feet tested patches of grass. There was risk in every exposure, but also freedom. Each act of contact, hands in dirt, faces to wind, was a quiet declaration that they were no longer merely hiding from the cold. They were stepping into something new, however uncertain. Homes that had been closed off from the elements were no longer sealed like tombs. Windows were pushed open, even if just a crack. Dust stirred, curtains fluttered. The smell of soot and smoke was replaced by the sharp, wet scent of thawed air. Rooms that had been lit only by fire now welcomed sunlight in slanted beams, casting warm shapes across stone floors. Children followed those beams with their fingers as if they were magic. Meals, though still humble, began to taste different. Not because the ingredients had changed, but because the people had. To have enough was no longer taken for granted. A bowl of broth felt like a banquet. A single egg in the morning was a victory. Fresh greens, those first peppery shoots from near the stream, were greeted with bowl reverence. They didn't eat with haste anymore. They paused. They tasted. They noticed. And there was laughter again. Not the loud, careless kind, but the type that sneaks out between shared glances. Someone would trip and then chuckle before anyone could tease. A child would tell a tale with such impossible exaggeration that adults laughed just to encourage the silliness. This kind of joy wasn't yet confident. It arrived in spurts, but each time it came, it lingered just a little longer. Craft returned to hands that had once only clung to survival. A woman rethreaded her loom and began weaving again, her fingers stiff at first, then rhythmic. A man whittled not for necessity, but to make something beautiful. The spoons he carved were smooth and ordinary, but each one was proof that time could be shaped again. The blacksmith, whose work had been limited to repairs and iron nails, began crafting tools with elegance, handles with curves, points with pride. Function no longer needed to be the only goal. There was room again for care. Old songs found their way into corners they'd long been chased from. Not sung in crowds yet, but hummed while chopping herbs, while mending hems, while cleaning lanterns. These melodies were heirlooms passed mouth to mouth, generation to generation, now brushed off like dusted relics. And in their quiet rise, they reminded people that not everything had been lost. At the edge of the villages, where fields met forest, life stirred in the underbrush. The trees, stripped for so long, wore buds like promises. Birds, those tireless messengers of hope, nested again in rafters and gutters. The fluttering of wings at dawn became part of the day's rhythm. No one cheered for them, but they listened, and in listening they believed again. Within churches the air grew less heavy. Incense, once used to mask the scent of death, now rose purely for praise. The priests wore simpler robes, spoke softer sermons. Their voices no longer carried the weight of warning. Instead, they offered remembrance, gratitude, and the gentle urging to begin again. There was less preaching, more listening, fewer commands, more blessings. It was not about saving souls, it was about stitching the frayed fabric of human spirit. People had begun to speak to the land again, to the fields, the rivers, the sky. Not in rituals or superstitions, but in the soft, respectful way one might speak to a patient friend. A man working soil would pause and whisper, "Thank you," though no one was near. A woman planting herbs outside her door might murmur encouragement to the seedlings, her voice full of love. These were not incantations. They were acknowledgements. The earth had taken so much, now it was giving back. Even the animals noticed. Dogs lay in sun-warmed doorways. Cats prowled with ease again, their ears no longer flattened by the cold. Horses, though lean, flicked their tails and snorted in the sunlight. The chickens, ever the harbingers of good news, clucked and strutted through open yards. They had endured the silence. Now they clattered joyfully through it. But not everything returned. There were still absences too sharp to ignore. A favourite tree had cracked and fallen. A small bridge had been swept away by meltwater. A path once used daily had been lost to a landslide. These losses weren't mourned with public grief. Instead, they were absorbed, carried forward like stones in a pocket. Always there, always felt but not dwelled on. People built new paths, not just through the landscape but through each other's lives. A family invited a neighbour to share their garden. A man offered his spare tools to a boy who'd lost his father. A widow opened her home to two sisters without parents. These arrangements weren't spoken of as charity. They weren't owed. They simply happened. One gesture at a time, like threads finding one another again. And with every gesture, trust returned. Not the blind trust of innocence, but the earned trust of survivors. They trusted that food would come, even if they didn't yet see it. That seasons would cycle again. That no matter how broken a roof or body or heart became, there were hands ready to help repair it. Even stories changed. Around fires, the tales weren't only about monsters in forests or heroes with swords. They became personal. A man spoke of how he kept a candle lit for 60 nights straight. A woman described her mother braiding her hair every morning even when they had no heat. Children listened, not with fear, but with fascination. These stories were not warnings, they were inheritances. As the days lengthened, people began to remember how to mark time again. Not just sun up and sun down. They tracked the days until the sheep gave birth, until the apples blossomed, until the next market visit. Hope, once a luxury, had become part of the calendar. There was space for art again. Not in galleries or books, but in the ordinary. A girl painted the side of a barn with crushed berries. A boy placed stones into the patterns near the riverbank. A man sang to his goats in verses that made no sense but brought him comfort. These acts weren't for display. They were for healing, for joy, for the sheer reminder that beauty was not gone. And at last, one evening, someone threw a celebration. It wasn't grand. It was a few benches pulled into a clearing, food passed hand to hand. A fiddle played until dusk. But it was enough. Children danced with bare feet. Old men clapped along. Women laughed with their whole faces, and no one asked why. They didn't need a reason. Surviving was reason enough. That night, under a sky dusted with stars, someone lit a lantern and placed it in the centre of the gathering. It wasn't to see by. It was to remember, to honour what had passed, and to guide them forward. Because even now they knew winter would come again. It always did. But next time they would be ready, not because they had found a way to escape its grip, but because they had discovered something stronger within themselves. And that strength, lit like a quiet fire, would not be extinguished. The 12th wave of spring's quiet return was not loud, not sudden. It slipped gently into daily life, like a forgotten tune rediscovered. It didn't sweep across the village like a storm. It crept in on the wings of small kindnesses, moments that had once seemed too far away to imagine. Where once everything had been brittle, now there was give. The landscape breathed, and so did the people. At first, no one trusted it fully. Warmth felt like a rumour. The way one might mistrust a stranger who smiles too quickly after betrayal, the sun was eyed with caution. But it stayed. Not every day was clear, and not every hour was gentle, but the cold no longer ruled. It had been pushed back, not by defiance alone, but by quiet endurance. And so, as the soil softened and streams murmured their thawed songs, the people emerged from their season of silence and began to speak to the world again. In the corners of homes, work returned to the hands that had once trembled from cold. Weaving, mending, brewing, tasks that had once been chores now became acts of renewal. Each stitch in a torn hem was more than fabric drawn together. It was a symbol of something healing, even if the broken things were seen differently. A cracked cup wasn't discarded. It was patched, honoured, used again. In a world that had nearly fallen apart, restoration was sacred. Children, having survived their first true winter of memory, ran with bare feet over damp grass. Their play had changed. No longer reckless, it now carried undertones of meaning. They weren't just pretending to be knights or woodland creatures. They were pretending they hadn't been afraid. They reenacted victories. Not battles with swords, but games of survival. Their laughter came in waves, shrill and piercing as if trying to outdo the silence that had hung so long. Elders, those with backs stooped and eyes cloudy from too many years of seeing too much, took their time stepping into the season. They watched more than they moved, watched the way moss returned to stone, watched the hens peck again in clean earth, watched the grandchildren learning to trust warmth again. These old ones did not speak of last winter unless pressed, but their silence wasn't avoidance, it was reverence. They had seen others go and they remained. That alone was a story. Marketplaces reopened, though cautiously. No grand stalls or colourful awnings, just simple gatherings of baskets and blankets, goods exchanged in whispers rather than barter cries. Dried mushrooms, bits of wool, a comb carved from birch, these weren't luxuries. These were the pieces of life slowly being stitched back together. Coins rarely changed hands. Instead, there were nods, favours, stories promised in return. The economy was not of gold, but of goodwill. In the woods, hunters moved again, but this time with humility. The animals were fewer, thinner, more skittish. Each step taken in the underbrush was mindful. They no longer hunted to stockpile, they hunted to share. A single rabbit was reason enough to cook for 3 homes. A snared bird fed not just mouths, but hope. Even the forest seemed to understand, offering what it could without reproach, provided the people came gently. Rivers swelled with runoff from distant hills. They became both barrier and blessing. Children tossed pebbles into the currents. Adults hauled buckets, washed clothes, traced their fingers along the surface as if remembering the miracle of flowing water. For so long, water had meant danger, ice, frost, illness. Now it offered sound, movement, life. Its presence, rushing and unpredictable, reminded them that the world could be wild without being cruel. At the chapel's edge, where gravestones leaned like weary soldiers, grass pushed upward through frozen ground. Flowers did not bloom in abundance, but a few brave blossoms broke through. These petals were not plucked or pressed. They were left untouched, their small rebellions against death given space. People visited those stones in silence, but no longer with hopelessness. They spoke not to grieve, but to remember, to promise those buried that life above would continue. The nights remained cool, yet fires were no longer built in desperation. Flames danced in hearths for comfort, not survival. Around these flames, songs were tried again, fragmented at first, the verses half forgotten. Someone would mumble a line, another would pick it up, the tune would fumble, stop, then start again, until eventually a chorus emerged. Not beautiful, perhaps, but real. The blacksmith took on new apprentices, not because he needed help, but because the future needed hands that could build. He passed down not just skill, but patience. The rhythm of hammer and anvil returned to the air, a heartbeat echoing across the village. Sparks flew like tiny stars, children watched from doorways, mothers listened while grinding grain. That sound, it meant things were being made again, not just endured. In kitchens, the scent of yeast and dried herbs returned. Broths became stews, stews became feasts, even if only shared by 2 or 3. A bit of butter on coarse bread, an egg boiled soft, a pot of tea sipped slowly. These things tasted different now, not because they were rare, but because they had once disappeared. Hunger had taught the tongue to treasure, and now even the most basic meal felt like a song sung to the body. Neighbours exchanged not gossip, but dreams. A new fence by summer, a goat that might birth twins, a child ready for apprenticeship. These weren't grand ambitions. They were sketches drawn from memory and rebuilt in courage. In every shared hope, there was risk. Hope meant daring to believe that the worst had passed. But the people had grown bold in quiet ways, and they dared. Along the roads, travellers returned. Ragged from their own journeys, but welcomed nonetheless. They brought news from other villages, stories of survival, hints of weather. They were fed without being asked, given shelter without demand. For who could turn away someone whose eyes still carried the reflection of snowdrifts and silence? These travellers reminded the villagers that they were not alone in what they had faced. Even the animals sensed the shift. Dogs no longer curled against stone walls for warmth. They played again, rolling in dust, barking at wind. Cows gave milk with greater ease. Horses pulled carts without needing coaxing. Life had not returned to how it was before, but it had returned in a form both familiar and new. And in quiet corners, love bloomed. Not just romance, but care. A hand held longer, a shared glance across a table, a letter written and left in a shoe. There was no room for extravagance, but affection became a currency of its own. Small gestures mattered. A scarf repaired, a spoon carved, a name whispered in sleep. These were the treasures now. No one spoke of forgetting. Forgetting would be betrayal. Instead, they remembered with gentleness. They remembered the way a candle burned low and still gave light. The way a neighbour gave their last carrot without being asked. The way the moon hung above the village like a witness. They remembered so they could move forward, not with burden, but with balance. And as the days stretched further and the evenings lingered longer, the people did not pretend that sorrow was gone. They simply carried it differently, not as a wound, but as a layer, something that deepened them, made them quieter, perhaps, but not weaker. The season had changed, the world had moved. And though winter would come again, as it always did, the people who had stood through the last one now knew something they hadn't before. That survival was not just the absence of death, but the presence of grace. That hope didn't have to be loud to be powerful, that sometimes just waking up and walking out into the sunlight was enough. And so they did, again and again, one step at a time. The 13th stretch into spring did not arrive as a moment, but as a sensation, a change in the air, not sharp but sure. It wasn't heralded by blooming meadows or warm breezes. It was found in the soft echo of footsteps on no longer frozen ground, in the way light shifted through trees that had been barren for far too long. A golden hue returned to the world, not in brilliance but in suggestion, like a memory turning vivid again. People began to recognize each other in a different light. Where once faces were drawn tight with hunger and dread, now there were creases from squinting into sunlight, from the tension beginning to leave jaws clenched for too many nights. It wasn't sudden. Healing never is. But slowly, layers of winter were being shed, off their bodies, off their homes, off their souls. Children were among the first to act as though nothing had ever gone wrong, not because they had forgotten, but because they had decided to move beyond. They built forts from thawed branches, drew shapes in the earth with sticks, splashed through puddles as if they'd never known cold toes or chapped skin. Their resilience was not loud. It was embedded in instinct. To play again was not to ignore the past. It was to declare that it hadn't won. Within the cottages that still stood firm, small acts of normalcy stitched the rhythm of life back together. Mothers hummed while preparing meals, the same tunes their mothers had once sung. Fathers wiped the soot from their hands and lifted their children onto their shoulders, not to carry them to safety this time, but just to see the world a little higher up. Firewood was gathered not in panic but in preparation. Wood piles became neat again, not because they feared shortage, but because order had returned. The elders, many of whom had lived through winters darker than most could remember, spoke less but watched more. They sat at thresholds and traced the movements of birds in the sky, recalling migrations once believed abandoned. They whispered names into the air, not in mourning but in homage, names of those who didn't endure, of those whose stories would now be told in lullabies and quiet evening tales. Memory had become a ritual, not a wound. A boy found a cracked mirror buried under a collapsed wall, cleaned it and hung it where light could strike. For the first time in many months, his family saw their faces clearly. The image was not kind, it showed the toll, but it was honest, and they did not flinch. Reflection, even though painful, was a sign that hiding had ended. They had lived, and they would not look away. In the fields, hands met earth with reverence. No one rushed the planting. The soil, though softening, was still reluctant, but they coaxed it, not with force, but with familiarity. The tools used were worn, blades dulled from the season's cruel edge. Still they turned the ground, pressed seeds into its belly, not out of routine but as offering. It was as though each grain of wheat was an apology and a promise in one. The river, once a frozen line of danger, now babbled again. Its song was hesitant at first, then bolder. Children dipped their toes, squealed, ran away, then returned. A girl dropped a flower into the current and watched it drift, whispering a hope not meant to be heard. The water carried it gently, not dragging or drowning, just moving forward, just like them. There was a woman who had lost everyone in her home that winter. For months she hadn't spoken, but one morning she walked into the market and handed a stranger a basket of herbs. No words, just the gesture. And it was enough. From then on others followed. Bread was left on stoops, blankets folded and placed where needed. Candles passed hand to hand. None of it required explanation. The gift was the language. The sharing was the sentence. Animals, once hidden deep in forest shadows, returned to the outskirts. Foxes trotted across lanes without fear. Deer wandered near fences at dusk. Even the crows, those clever black-eyed watchers, cawed less like omens and more like neighbours. The natural world had taken its own time to heal, but it too was returning, not exactly as before, but close enough to feel like home. In the evenings, the glow of lanterns flickered from one window to another, like constellations across the village. Light, once so carefully rationed, became something shared again. People sat on steps, on stumps, on patched benches. They didn't need to speak. The presence of one another was the dialogue, a touch on a shoulder, a glance that lingered. These were the words of a people who had nothing left to prove, only everything left to live. A boy played a wooden flute, the same 3 notes over and over. They weren't in tune, but someone began to clap softly, and another hummed, until the melody stretched and became something resembling music. Not perfect, but full. That was how things grew now, not from perfection, but from persistence. At the edge of the village, there was a tree that had split in the ice storm. One half stood, the other lay twisted and rotting. Rather than cut it down, someone carved the stump into a bench. It became a place to sit, to rest, to talk. A reminder that even what breaks can be shaped into something of use, something of meaning. Priests no longer spoke only of suffering. They spoke of resurrection, not in the grand biblical sense, but in the quiet human one. A cup passed, a room warmed, a neighbour helped. They talked of fire not as judgment, but as warmth. They spoke of saints, yes, but also of mothers, of shepherds, of those who had stayed. Faith was no longer something demanded. It was something felt, in the presence of others, in the scent of rising bread, in the softening of soil. Even silence changed. It was no longer haunted. Now it breathed. You could sit in a room and not feel the need to fill it. The stillness was no longer emptiness. It was space. Space to feel, to dream, to begin. And dreams returned. They were not grand, not castles or crowns. They were humble. A child growing strong, a roof that didn't leak, a harvest that lasted the winter. These dreams were planted like seeds and watered with patience. They would not all come true, but they were dared, and that was enough. There was a new kind of strength among the people now, not the kind that flexes or shouts, the kind that endures, that listens, that waits. It was in the way people held each other's gaze, in how they stood beside graves and didn't cry anymore, not because the grief was gone, but because it had become part of them, something folded in. The village looked different now, not just from the damage, but from the rebuilding. A wall made of mismatched stones, a roof patched with cloth until thatch could be gathered. The well surrounded by flowers that had not been planted, only encouraged. These imperfections weren't hidden, they were honoured. Because what had survived the cold was not just life, it was meaning. It was choice, the choice to love again, to build again, to laugh and sing and cry and carry forward. They had come through fire and frost and famine. What remained was what mattered most. And as the moon rose over fields now green and speckled with new beginnings, the people turned their faces upward. They did not make wishes. They did not pray out loud. They simply breathed. And in that breath was the echo of everything they'd endured, and everything still waiting to be made. The 14th turning of the sun since the last frost seemed to unfold more inwardly than outwardly. It was as though the villagers, having weathered the longest cold their bones had ever remembered, had become their own seasons, carrying warmth slowly back into themselves, as one carries flame cupped in their hands through a wind that might yet return. The wind hadn't left, after all. It still passed through the hills in the evenings, sharp and testing, but it no longer ruled. It no longer told them when to cower. They had learned to look it in the eye. In the early light, men rose without being called, not out of urgency, but out of habit turned sacred. Their boots met dew-covered grass, and they didn't flinch. They simply walked into the mist with shovels or ropes, carts or hopes. The weight they carried wasn't all physical. It was the memory of months where nothing grew, where even breath felt scarce. But they carried it lightly now, not because it had lessened, but because they had become stronger. Women too stepped out of their doorways with fresh eyes. They looked at the sky, not with suspicion, but curiosity. The clouds no longer spelled doom. They read them like stories. They planted small things, not because they expected immediate reward, but because planting had become a form of belief. Herbs in windows, beans near fences, fruit pits tucked into corners of the yard. They planted as if the world could hear them whisper, "Come back to life." And life did answer, albeit slowly, with stubbornness. A patch of wild onions burst through the thaw. A vine curled around a post that had been bare for too long. Bees returned, clumsy in their early dances, bumping into flowers like drunk poets. The villagers smiled without realizing they were doing it. They nodded at bees. They nodded at each other. Not everything had to be spoken. Inside, houses once sealed with cloth and fear were now open to the breeze. The scent of pine drifted in, damp wood warmed in the hearth, not for survival, but for comfort. Children napped with arms stretched out, no longer curled into themselves. Blankets became toys again, tents, cloaks, sails for imaginary ships. The games they invented had changed. They didn't fight monsters, they built sanctuaries. They made up towns where no one was cold, where everyone had stew. Old men gathered not just for stories, but for silence. They would sit outside the blacksmith's hut or by the edge of the well and not say much at all. They didn't need to. The simple act of being present meant everything now. To see one another still breathing, still walking, that was the tale. The words could come later. There were new voices too. Babies born during the bleakest months now giggled from bundles strapped to backs, or toddled in the mud under watchful eyes. These were the children who had arrived when no one had any space for joy. But joy had made its own room, and now, as tiny hands grabbed hold of spring's offerings, twigs, petals, beetles, their presence felt like prophecy. They were proof that not all things ended. Young men had taken up tools without being asked. Saws moved through wood with practiced effort. Nails were pounded with measured resolve. They were building not just for need, but for the future. A barn expansion, a new fence, a bench for a widow who no longer had the strength to stand at church. These acts weren't talked about. They were done. Each board hammered in place was a declaration. We are still here. In the evenings, meals stretched a little longer. The food wasn't abundant, but it was shared with more laughter now. Someone might bring out a pickled apple or a saved sliver of cheese, and the whole room would act as though a king had arrived. Blessings were said with mouths full. Elbows bumped in close quarters. There were no complaints. Sometimes the fire was let go out on purpose, just to see the stars. Families stood in the dark, looking up at the heavens they had once cursed for their silence. Now they stood not in defiance, but in awe. The sky had changed. Or maybe they had. Either way, they looked longer. No one rushed back inside. The church bell, once reserved for mourning, rang again for celebration. A wedding, a birth, a festival of sorts. No one remembered why it had been celebrated before, but they brought it back anyway. Bread was baked in shared ovens. A wheel of soft cheese appeared like magic. A fiddle cried out an old tune, and bodies moved without grace but with joy. No one criticised. They danced for the sake of dancing. In the woods, something stirred that hadn't been seen in years. A wild boar, a spotted owl, the return of creatures too cautious to risk winter's wrath. Their presence told a story without words. Nature forgives. Slowly, but surely, and the people took note. They began walking differently, less like conquerors, more like guests. There was a boy who found a stone shaped like a heart. He brought it to his mother with pride, and she placed it above their door. That stone became legend. Children would touch it before leaving for chores. Adults would tap it with 2 fingers, as if to say, keep us steady. It wasn't superstition. It was a symbol that even among rubble, something could be beautiful. A girl found her voice again. She'd stopped speaking after losing her sister. One day she sang. No one told her to stop. Her melody floated out the open window, across the yard, up into the trees. No one clapped. They listened. Not because the song was perfect, but because it was hers. And it was finally free. The potter's hands, once too stiff from frost to shape clay, now moved with surety. Bowls formed, simple and wide. Mugs with crooked handles. He gave most of them away. People brought him scraps, ash, bone, crushed eggshells for glaze. He turned them into colour. No one understood how, but the pottery glowed, and that was enough. A girl painted the side of a shed with charcoal and water. Swirls, birds, a sun with too many rays. Her brothers teased her until their father told them to hush. Then he asked her to paint their door. The world had gone so long without colour they were ready for even the messiest version of it. Hope no longer had to be spoken. It was worn like an invisible coat, woven into every glance, every shared task. It didn't mean certainty. It didn't mean the hard days were over. It meant there was room again, for laughter, for plans, for silence without dread. And though the next frost would come, as all seasons turn, they would face it differently. Not because it would be kinder, but because they had learned to be kinder to themselves. They had remembered how to live, not in spite of what they'd lost, but because of it. The 15th passing of weeks since the Frost's retreat no longer felt like recovery. It began to feel like rebirth. Not loud or explosive, not drenched in fanfare or majesty. It arrived instead in the texture of things. The softened edge of a wooden spoon now sanded smooth. The subtle warmth of soil that held the promise of food. The rustle of linen drying in the breeze. These details wove a world quietly becoming whole again. And in this blooming silence the people began to uncoil. They no longer walked with their shoulders pressed up against their ears or their eyes always scanning the sky. There was a looseness in their limbs now. A grace in how they bent to tie a shoe, lift a child, or pat the flank of a horse. Even those still nursing invisible wounds allowed themselves to look forward without flinching. Early in the mornings, before the rooster's call had fully claimed the day, the village stirred. Footsteps shuffled on floors no longer frozen. Hearths were stirred not in desperation, but simply to greet the day with warmth. Bread dough was stretched and left to rise on windowsills. Teas brewed from herbs just beginning to poke through garden beds. These were not luxuries. They were acknowledgements. Of survival. Of continuity. Of something deeper than routine. A woman named Elna, once known for her skill in dyeing fabrics, reopened her tiny shed by the stream. For months it had stood locked, its shutters nailed against wind. Now, with her fingers cracked but eager, she dipped cloth into vats she had quietly tended with stored roots and powders. The colours weren't bold, they were muted, soft, the kind you'd find in riverstones or fog at dawn. But when she hung those fabrics to dry, they danced like flags of resilience. No one asked to buy them. She gave them away, to wrap babies, to lay on tables, to drape over shoulders when the wind still whispered memories of ice. The healer in the village, an old woman with a back like a comma and a laugh that came in wheezes, began walking her rounds again. She didn't knock, just entered, touched foreheads, stirred pots of broth, pressed her palms to backs and said, "Breathe." She never asked what hurt, she always knew. Her medicine wasn't only in the herbs she carried, but in her presence. She had made it through, and by simply walking reminded others that they could too. There was a tree near the centre of the village that had been struck by lightning the year before, charred on one side yet still clinging to life. Children played around its trunk, weaving stories about monsters or kings. Adults gathered beneath its branches, some still blackened, others sprouting new leaves. They didn't name it anything dramatic, but it became a kind of symbol nonetheless. The tree that burned and did not fall, the tree that lived. Even those who had lost the most found themselves inching back toward connection. A man who had buried his daughter in the heart of winter now carved toys out of scraps for neighbour children. A woman who had not spoken since her brother's passing began to hum while sweeping her doorstep. Their wounds didn't vanish. They became doors instead of prisons, portals through which love, even cautious, could enter again. And there were moments of astonishment. A bloom of wildflowers where none had grown for years. A calf born with a perfect star on its forehead. A comet or something like it, streaking across the sky just before midnight, seen by nearly everyone and spoken of in whispers as a sign, not of superstition but of reminder, that the world was still full of things that surpassed explanation, and that was comforting. Tools long neglected were pulled from sheds and oiled, not because they had a specific job to do, but because people remembered what it meant to prepare. The preparation itself became meaningful. Blades sharpened, spools of twine rewound, buckets mended. It was not just about tending fields or fixing roofs, it was about readiness, about faith that something was coming, something better. The fields, slowly greening, carried a different rhythm now. The rows planted were not perfect. Some seeds sprouted at odd angles, some never took. But the villagers didn't curse them, they walked the earth with softer steps, spoke to the plants as if they were neighbours. They touched the shoots gently, as though afraid they might wake them too quickly. On the edges of those fields, laughter often drifted from small groups. Friends repairing fences or hauling compost or dragging broken carts out of ditches. They joked more now, not just to distract, but to express gratitude. Humour had returned as a form of relief, as proof that even beneath everything lost, the capacity to smile had never fully died. The village forge, for weeks silent, now sang again. Sparks lit the air like tiny stars. Metal rang under hammer with a sound that pulled people in like music. The smith didn't speak much, he never had, but his eyes gleamed when he worked. Watching him, one felt a certain kind of reassurance. If a horseshoe could be shaped again, if a broken hinge could hold firm once more, perhaps hearts could be mended too. Small rituals re-emerged, ones forgotten in the urgency of survival. Candles lit not for prayer but for mood. Braided hair for celebration. Games played with pebbles and coins. Someone even baked a pie from stored berries, and though the crust crumbled, they shared it as though it were treasure. One boy began carving birds from bits of driftwood, not because he'd been taught, because he needed to. Each bird different, some with wings extended, some at rest. He hung them from branches and eaves, nailed them to fences. He didn't explain why. But when the wind blew and they turned and danced, no one questioned it. They meant something. That was enough. A group of children formed what they called a secret council. They wore cloaks stitched from leftover scraps, held meetings in the hollow of a tree, made decisions about important matters like naming a lost lamb or organising a pebble race. The adults didn't laugh. They watched and smiled. For the children were learning how to lead, how to dream, how to imagine futures better than their past. And when it rained, because the rain did come as it must, it was not feared. People stood under awnings and porches and let it fall. It wasn't the rain of winter, sharp and cruel. It was softer, a kind of baptism. The earth opened to it. So did they. At night, fires still burned, but not to chase cold. They burned for warmth of a different kind, gathering warmth. People came close not just for heat, but for stories. Tales from long ago, from elders, from travellers passing through. Stories of courage, of foolishness, of love that had defied odds. These weren't distractions anymore. They were medicine. And slowly, very slowly, people stopped measuring time by what had been lost. Instead, they began to mark the days by what had returned. A voice, a smile, a calf's first step, a loaf that rose just right. Not everything came back. Some things never would, but enough did, and with each return they stitched themselves together, not back to who they were, but forward into who they could become. The 16th unravelling of days since the ice gave way to soil was no longer measured by the calendar or the sky. It was felt in the breath of the earth, in the softness of footsteps along paths once hardened by frost, in the way sleep returned gently to those who once feared closing their eyes. The villagers didn't count days as much as they noticed moments now, like when a seed finally broke through the crust of the land, or when someone laughed so suddenly that it startled the birds nearby. In the hush of morning, the kind where the fog still clung low over rooftops like a whisper refusing to rise, people began to find music in the mundane. The creak of a door, the splash of water from a wooden pail, the scratch of a broom across floorboards, all became part of the daily symphony of aliveness. It was not orchestrated, it was not meant to impress, it simply was, and after what they had endured, that was enough. One man, who had once been a fisherman before the river froze and swallowed his nets, began carving oars again. He didn't own a boat anymore, but his hands remembered the motion. The act of shaping wood, of smoothing the grain, was more than a trade. It was an act of remembering who he had been and who he might still be. People came to him not to buy, but to sit nearby, to watch someone do something slowly, purposefully. The village had grown tired of rushing. Along the edges of fences, ivy had begun to reclaim its place. It was wild, undisciplined, crawling wherever it wished. No one tried to tame it. They welcomed the unruliness. It was nature writing its own song across their repairs. Beauty didn't need to be precise anymore. It only needed to be alive. Children gathered stones and built towers in the yards. They stacked them in silence, then knocked them over and laughed. They didn't need explanations. Their hands moved because they could. Their joy came not from finishing, but from doing. Every toppled pile was a reminder. It's okay to begin again. Evenings belonged to fires, but not just for warmth or light. Fires became places of gathering, of remembering, of telling the truth gently. Stories no longer had to be exciting. They could be ordinary. Like how a mother once patched the same blanket 7 times, or how a neighbour gave away his last onion with a shrug. These were the legends now, not of war or kings, but of kindness under pressure. The baker's hands, once stiff from cold, now moved with ease. He didn't make many loaves, just enough, and those who received them understood what it meant to hold one still warm in their hands. A loaf wasn't just food, it was proof that the world could rise again. Somewhere in the hills, a songbird that hadn't been heard for years returned. No one knew its name, but everyone stopped when it sang. It wasn't a loud song, it barely cut through the quiescent, but it was persistent. And so the people listened, not with urgency, but with reverence. The sound wasn't just music, it was memory, arriving on wings. A young girl, too small to recall much of the winter herself, took it upon herself to collect things that smell good. Bits of mint, petals from wildflowers, dried orange peel from someone's cupboard. She kept them in a pouch and held them to people's noses without asking. Most smiled, a few cried. The scents reminded them of things they thought lost. Grandmothers, spring markets, fields that once bloomed with lavender. That child unknowingly became a healer. And then there was the well, no longer the centre of worry, but a meeting place again. People gathered there with empty jugs and full hearts. They waited their turn, exchanged little gifts. An egg, a spoonful of lard, a story from the road. No one demanded anything. The sharing was quiet, mutual, instinctual. Some had scars now, physical ones from frostbite, from accidents in the dark. But no one covered them with shame. They were worn like bark on a tree, rough, but earned. When the sun hit them, they shone. These marks were not ugly. They were reminders of endurance made visible. A group of widows began meeting every third morning to walk together. They didn't call it a ritual. They didn't explain. They just walked, shoulders brushing, their silence as loud as any sermon. The village understood what it meant. Grief walks beside us, but it doesn't get to lead forever. The soil, once cracked and starved, opened itself to the spade. The crops planted were modest: potatoes, cabbage, barley. Nothing exotic, but each shoot that broke through was treated like a miracle. Children guarded them like pets. Adults knelt beside them, whispering things they didn't share with anyone else. Blessings, maybe, or apologies, or just breath. There was one boy who refused to wear shoes even when the ground was cold. When asked why, he said it was because he liked to feel the earth move under him. And maybe that was the point. After being numb for so long, the villagers had begun to crave sensation. Even discomfort felt like proof of being here. One night, the stars came out in full, clearer than anyone could recall. Someone brought a blanket, others followed. They lay side by side in the grass, pointing, guessing, wondering. No one needed to be right. It was the looking up that mattered. It was the shared silence, the simple awe that hadn't needed words. An older man took to carving birds into the beams of his home. Not real birds, ones he imagined. Wings too wide, tails like rivers. He'd lost both sons to illness. He never spoke their names, but when people saw the carvings, they understood. The house became a shrine not to death, but to the possibility of flight after it. Even sickness, when it came, was no longer met with fear alone. People gathered herbs, heated towels, offered presents. No one was left alone. They had learned, too painfully, that distance could be cruel. So now they leaned in. They watched each other sleep. They brewed extra broth. They waited beside the bed, not to fix what they couldn't, but to witness it. Seasons no longer felt like something to be endured. They became markers of return. Spring meant not just warmth, but community. Summer would mean stories around bonfires. Autumn, preparation. Not from fear, but from wisdom. And even winter, when it came again, would not surprise them. It would be received with eyes open and hearts ready. The wind still had teeth, but it no longer bit. The rains could still flood the corners of the village, but people danced in them now. Thunder rolled across the hills, and instead of hiding, children chased it with sticks, pretending to harness lightning. What had changed wasn't just the weather, it was the people themselves. They were no longer afraid of breaking. They had broken already, and found that they could still move, still sing, still plant and share and shape. They knew now what they hadn't before, that survival isn't the same as living, but it's the bridge that leads to it. The 17th drift of days since the frost loosened its grip unfolded like a story told without words. The village had stopped looking backward, not from denial, but from necessity. They'd already spoken their grief in glances, sung it through trembling fingers, buried it beneath seeds and wooden beams. Now what remained was a quiet leaning into life, not as it had been, but as it was becoming. And in this unfolding they learned that healing is not grand. It is small. It lives in things unnoticed. A nail hammered straight. A puddle jumped into. A smile that arrives before the face remembers how to hold it. No one claimed to be whole again, but wholeness wasn't the point. They were together. They were warm. They were waking up. In the hush of dawn, where mist lingered like a forgotten breath across the fields, someone left flowers at the chapel door. Not arranged, not cut properly, just wild stems tied with a frayed thread. There was no note, but everyone knew who had placed them. A woman who had never spoken since the day she watched her husband vanish into the snowstorm and not return. She had not said his name aloud in seasons, but now, flowers, in bloom, on sacred steps. That was her voice. The shepherd boy who once dragged his feet through every chore now ran ahead of the flock, laughing as he called to the lambs. He'd taken to naming them after stars, tracing constellations through their paths as they moved across the hillside. "This one is Lyra," he'd say, pointing at a ewe that always wandered. "And that's Orion, because he's brave but a bit clumsy." The sheep didn't understand, but they followed him all the same. The woman who mended cloaks, known by most simply as Tessa, now stitched hearts into the lining of each garment. Tiny ones, unseen from the outside. No two the same. It wasn't a trick of the trade. It was her way of putting protection into the seams. People started to ask for her coats by name, not because they were warmer, but because wearing them felt like being remembered. A man who had once kept pigeons but lost them all in the bitterest month built a new coop, though he swore he wouldn't. He said he had no need for birds anymore. But one day he stood in the market holding a hatchling in his palm and his eyes betrayed him. The vendor gave it to him for free. "Just one," he muttered, pretending it wasn't already a promise. By nightfall the coop had 3. Children drew on the sides of barns with chalk. Crooked sons, wonky horses, faces that looked suspiciously like their parents. No one told them to stop. In fact, a few elders added to the art. A crescent moon here, a flower there. The village had become a canvas, not pristine but lived in. Honest. The teacher who had lost her pupils to migration, famine, or simply vanishing, set out a table under a tree with 3 books and 1 stool. She sat there each morning. Sometimes no one came. Sometimes 5 children squeezed onto that stool and argued over a sentence. One girl, too shy to speak, traced the letters with her finger in the air and smiled when they made sense. The teacher didn't cry, she simply turned the page. Someone found a mirror, unbroken, tucked behind an old chest in the attic of a home no longer occupied. They hung it on the side of the bakery, not for vanity, just to reflect the world again. To let people see themselves smiling, even if only briefly, even if they weren't sure why. And then there was the river. No longer iced over, it had begun to hum, not roar, not rush. Hum. Its surface shimmered like spun glass in the afternoon, and children returned to skipping stones. The smooth clack of each pebble echoed down the valley like a heartbeat. The elder who'd once warned them of icy banks now joined in, failing miserably at first, but eventually sending a stone dancing 5 skips across the surface. They all cheered, and for that moment, he was 10 years old again. In the orchard, the trees were slow to bud, a stubbornness earned through many hard winters. But one morning, the tiniest blush of blossom appeared on a limb no one had expected to survive. A child saw it first and ran through the village yelling, "It's pink! It's pink!" as if that colour were a miracle. Maybe it was. People began to build benches in odd places, by the stream, near the road, beside graves, places to pause, not for show, not as decoration, but because they'd learned the value of stillness, of watching time pass not as an enemy, but as a companion who walks just far enough ahead to keep you moving. A man with a voice like gravel started singing in the evenings, not for performance, just to himself. Old folk songs, mostly half-remembered, stitched together with humming. But one night, others joined in. Harmonies stumbled into place, someone clapped, someone cried, a fire was lit. It wasn't a concert, it was communion. A child asked if winter would come back, and their mother answered, "Yes, but we'll meet it differently next time." And they believed her. Because they had seen the other side. They had stepped through the cold and returned changed, not broken. The woods, once a place of fear, began to welcome feet again. Mushrooms peeked from beneath logs. Birds flitted in lazy arcs. Someone found a patch of wild strawberries. They didn't take them all, just enough to taste. They left the rest for others. That kind of sharing had become second nature. The bell in the centre of the village, long silent except for funerals, rang one morning for no reason at all. Or maybe every reason. No announcement, no celebration, just sound, joy in a circle, a reminder that the village lived, that it had not been buried beneath the snow, that breath still rose from its chimneys, that laughter could spill from its windows. There were still aches, of course, still nights when someone woke with memories clinging to their chest like vines. But they weren't alone anymore. There were hands now, arms to wrap around, voices to soothe, people who stayed through the silence. And that staying, that choice to remain even when the worst had passed, was perhaps the most powerful thing of all. Because it meant rebuilding not out of guilt or duty, but out of love. A love deep enough to bend under weight, to shiver through storms, to wait through winters, and still bloom come spring. By the 18th wave of days since the deep chill had loosened its grasp, something subtle began to take root, not just in soil, not just in stone or wood, but in the way people carried themselves through the lanes and across the yards of their humble whirl. It was an inward blooming, not bold, not loud, just steady, like a low hum that rises without ever turning into a shout. It showed in the tilt of heads, in the sway of arms now freed from constant tension, in the ease with which they lingered in doorways instead of rushing inside. It was in the way a girl tied ribbon around her braid again, not because it was necessary, but because it pleased her to do so, in the way a boy skipped 2 steps instead of 1, in the quiet hum that slipped from someone's lips while they swept their porch, unaware that anyone was near enough to hear it. It was the small choices that mattered now, and the quiet bravery to make them. Each morning the light climbed over rooftops a little earlier, and the windows welcomed it without the burden of frost. The shutters stayed open longer, even into the night, letting in air that no longer bit. Curtains moved like sighs, and people stood near those windows not to keep watch, but to simply be still for a while. Stillness had become safe again. There was a woman who had begun baking not for her household, but simply because she liked the scent. She made sweet rolls she couldn't eat and left them by the well. No name, no price, just a bit of cinnamon and kindness resting on the cloth beside a chipped mug of warm tea. And the mug never stayed empty. Someone always refilled it. That was the unspoken agreement. They would keep each other full. A man who had once played the fiddle but lost the nerve during the worst days began to sit at the corner of the square and tune his instrument again. At first he only plucked the strings, unsure, tentative. Then a bow appeared in his hands, not long after notes, scratchy, searching but alive, and no one told him to stop. Some paused their work to listen, others just smiled as they passed, offering nods of encouragement more meaningful than applause. A group of children created something they called a treasure map, though there was no treasure, only the joy of searching. They buried pebbles, marked trees, whispered riddles into hollow stumps. Their laughter travelled between cottages like birdsong. Adults found themselves roped into the game, pretending not to know where the path led. They allowed themselves to be led, even if only for an afternoon. One morning a chair appeared in the middle of the common path with a note that read, "Sit if you're tired, or if you're not." It wasn't signed, but everyone took turns using it, sometimes to tie a shoe, sometimes to rest a basket, sometimes just to close their eyes and let the sun touch their cheeks. No one removed it. That chair became part of the landscape, an invitation to pause. A young boy who had gone mute after the loss of his grandfather began whistling again. No melody, just sound, unformed and unpolished. But it carried through the streets like a flag waving in the wind. When he stopped, people missed it. They asked him kindly to begin again, and he did. In the fields, the rows of green began to stretch toward the horizon, as if the land itself were unfurling its arms after a long sleep. The crops weren't perfect, some patches still refused to grow, but no one cursed the stubborn spots. They tended them anyway, as one might a friend still healing. The soil had taught them patience. It had taught them how to wait without resentment. A pair of old friends who had not spoken in years due to a quarrel too old to remember shared a loaf of bread without comment. No apology was spoken, it wasn't needed. Their sitting side by side in the shade was the apology, and the forgiveness, and the beginning. A girl with too much energy to stay indoors began arranging stones into patterns near the entrance of the village. Spirals, circles, winding paths of grey and white and brown. At first, people thought they were just for play, but over time they began walking through them slowly, thoughtfully, as though the stones held meaning beyond their shape. And maybe they did. The nights grew softer, stars didn't seem so distant anymore. The moon no longer felt like a reminder of everything lost, but a witness to everything slowly returning. People stayed up late for no reason, simply to sit under the sky. Conversations became more meandering. Topics wandered like the breeze. No one cared about conclusions, only the presence. Rain came again, but it was not dreaded. It washed the dust from roofs, left beads on windows, fed the roots below their feet. Children ran through it barefoot. Adults stood with faces turned upward, mouths open to catch drops. The rain didn't steal from them anymore. It gave. There was an old woman who sang to the hens as she collected eggs. Her voice was cracked, more whisper than melody, but she claimed it made them lay better. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. The act of singing had become the point. The hens listened, or seemed to, and that was enough. Tools passed from hand to hand, not just hammers and saws, but ideas, recipes, songs. People offered what they had without ceremony. A bundle of mint for tea, a carved ladle, a jar of pickled beets. Trade was replaced by offering, not bartering, not keeping score, just giving and receiving, and trusting it would all balance out in the end. One afternoon a stranger arrived. Thin, quiet, eyes like the edge of a storm. He didn't say much, just asked if there was water. A family fed him without question, gave him a blanket, a corner by the fire. In the morning he helped split wood, then moved on. No one asked where he was going. No one needed to. Some journeys don't require explanation, only kindness along the way. A child asked her mother what day it was, and the mother had to think before answering. Not because she forgot, but because it no longer mattered the way it used to. The important thing wasn't what day it was, but what it held. Who you spoke with, what you tasted, whether the air smelled of wood smoke or rain. They no longer needed ceremonies to mark survival. Their lives had become the ritual, every meal shared, every gate mended, every time someone reached out without being asked. That was the new scripture. A living gospel written in dirt and breath and open hands. By the time the 19th stretch of days drifted into their rhythm, the change wasn't just in the weather, it was in the marrow of their lives. You could see it in the eyes of the old, once clouded by resignation, now lit with a quiet kind of daring. You could hear it in the way footsteps no longer hesitated outside a neighbour's home. The land had softened, but so had they. The community no longer moved with urgency, but with purpose. Their work wasn't frantic. It wasn't about surviving the hour or preparing for disaster. It had evolved into something sacred. The tending of land, the care of animals, the mending of tools. Each act became a conversation with the world around them. Not one of demand, but of respect. One morning a boy carried a bird's nest he'd found fallen near the stream. Not to keep, not to tame. He held it like a relic, showed it to his mother, then gently returned it to a branch nearby. That boy, who had once thrown rocks for fun, now watched where he stepped. And it wasn't because someone scolded him. The world had taught him something directly, through frost, through hunger, through loss, and it had stayed. In the centre of the village, an old man began drawing with charcoal on the side of his cottage. Not letters, not messages, just shapes. Spirals, arches, flames. At first, no one asked why. Then they joined him. Children added their own markings beside his. What began as a wall became a mural. It wasn't beautiful in the way paintings in books were. It was more honest than that. It looked like healing. A girl with no siblings started collecting sounds. She kept a little box of items, a dried leaf that crinkled, a shell that whistled when blown, a bit of tin that chimed when struck. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her voice held music in it. Not because she tried to be poetic, because she understood how rare silence was, and how precious the noises that filled it had become. Evenings had taken on a new tone, not the desperate kind where every log thrown on the fire felt like a question of survival. Now, firelight meant gathering. Faces close to the glow, shadows stretching across walls. People leaned in not to warm their hands, but to listen to one another breathe, to remind themselves they were still here, together. The air smelled different too, not just because of flowers or earth, but because the scent of fear had finally started to fade. In its place came cooking smoke, leather being cured, herbs drying on ropes. These were signs of living, not just lasting. One man had begun writing again, not for an audience, he didn't even know if he'd ever share it, but simply to remember. He carved sentences into thin pieces of bark, then tucked them under stones, between fence rails, in the hollows of tree trunks. He called them word seeds, said maybe they'd sprout somewhere someday, maybe someone would need them, maybe not, but he left them anyway. A woman who once refused to leave her cottage now hosted tea every 5th day. No invitations, no ceremony, just a door propped open and a pot on the stove. People came and went. Some stayed for a few minutes. Some lingered until the sky darkened. It wasn't about tea. It was about the courage it took to open the door again. A family who had lost their cow was given one by 3 neighbours who pooled their coin. The cow wasn't grand, it limped slightly, but it gave milk. It warmed the barn, it stood as a gift too large for words. The family never stopped saying thank you, even though no one required it. In the schoolroom, now just a corner of the chapel with a bench and slate, the children had begun writing poems, not assigned, not graded, just made. One boy scribbled something about thunder being a giant's yawn. A girl wrote that the wind sounded like her mother's lullaby. The teacher read each one aloud with the reverence of scripture. A bridge that had cracked during the hard freeze was finally mended. Not by one person, but by many. Planks replaced by hands that had never held hammers before. Ropes tied by those who had once been too young to trust with knots. The bridge held, and when they crossed it for the first time, they didn't cheer. They just walked slowly, taking in the view from the middle, something they hadn't been able to do for over a year. There was a celebration that week, no holiday, no Saint's Day, just a gathering. Someone roasted turnips, another brought honey bread. A woman sang, an elder danced. A toddler wandered into the centre and spun in circles until they fell laughing. There was no schedule, no speeches, only presence, and that was more than enough. The woods had grown safer too, not because they changed, but because people remembered how to move through them, slowly, respectfully. A boy spotted a fox and didn't chase it. A woman found mushrooms and only picked a few, leaving the rest untouched. The forest responded with more birdsong, more green. Old wounds didn't vanish, but they softened. A man whose brother had been lost to frost now spent his mornings tending the graveyard paths, brushing snow away from names. He whistled while he worked, not out of joy, but out of connection, out of duty to memory. One day, a rainbow appeared, wide and bright and impossibly close. Children swore they could touch it. Adults stared as if seeing colour for the first time. For a few moments, everything stopped. Even the birds seemed quieter. And when it faded, no one was disappointed. They were simply grateful they'd seen it. Someone built a swing between 2 trees, not for their children, but for anyone. It creaked with age, but it held strong. Elders sat on it in the evenings, letting it rock them gently, faces toward the horizon. Teenagers whispered secrets on it after dark. Toddlers clung to the ropes with fierce delight. That swing became a kind of sanctuary. The village was no longer just a place marked on a map. It had become a rhythm and a language, a shared breath. Each building a verse, each path a sentence, each act of kindness a punctuation mark in a story being written, not with ink, but with lives. By the 20th circle of waking and sleeping since the frost had given way to bloom, the village had become something more than the collection of timber, thatch, and stone it had once seemed to be. It had become a living testament to what a community can become when it decides not to break apart under weight, but to lean in, together, with quiet persistence. There were still days heavy with silence, and nights where shadows curled around windows a little too long. But the difference now was this. No one stood alone in the dark. In one corner of the village, a carpenter began making cradles again. His hands, once stiff from disuse, now moved with patience. He carved not just for babies soon to be born, but for hope itself. Every cradle was an act of belief that life would continue, that children would cry again, that laughter would bounce off stone walls long after these days had passed. He lined each one with soft cloth embroidered with small, simple threads. He never asked for coin, he only asked for blessings for the family who received it, and every cradle, placed in a home, became a small altar to beginnings. An older woman with silver-streaked hair who had long ago stopped tending her garden now knelt daily in her yard. She planted marigolds and rosemary, not just for their use, but for their scent, their colour, their stubborn refusal to be ignored. When people passed her fence, she waved, not always with her hand, but with her eyes, bright and steady. She didn't need to speak to be heard anymore. Her flowers said everything. The rhythm of the forge returned, not as a roar, but as a heartbeat. Metal sang again. Not for weapons, not for urgency, but for hinges, for pots, for horseshoes and door latches. The smith had begun humming while he worked, and some claimed the tools themselves held onto that music. Tools passed between hands like talismans. They fixed gates. They split logs. They carved symbols into barn doors. Work became prayer. Down near the stream, a girl with a limp gathered smooth stones and painted them with faces. She called them her stone family. She placed them in a circle and sat among them, telling stories to the wind. Others began leaving pebbles near her circle, unmarked, but placed with intention. Soon the stone family became a village all its own, small, silent, watching. The girl smiled more now. She didn't speak, but she listened to everything. On the hilltop, a man with a flute carved from bone played to the horizon. The notes floated far, bending through tree branches and across rooftops. Birds began to gather when he played. Children sat nearby without asking questions. His music didn't need lyrics. It carried the weight of things too big for words and too tender for silence. A well-worn blanket was found tied between two trees on the forest's edge, creating a makeshift hammock. No one claimed it, but everyone used it. Some napped there, some read, some cried, hidden beneath the folds. The forest didn't mind, it swayed gently with the breath of each visitor. The trees became quiet companions. One child spent hours arranging sticks into shapes only he could decipher. A star, a bird, a door. When asked what he was doing, he answered, "Making paths for dreams to walk on." No one corrected him, they only nodded, and some began leaving their own small offerings among his designs. Feathers, dried petals, acorns. It became a map of unseen things. People no longer walked straight from one place to another. They wandered, they paused, they stopped to help lift a pail or gather fallen apples. They shared water without asking. They built benches under trees and named them things like Thinking Place or Memory Spot, names that meant nothing to outsiders, but everything to them. A man who'd once shouted at the wind for taking his son now whispered, "Thank you to the soil for giving him back his voice." He had started planting trees, one every fortnight, each in honour of a memory too heavy to hold inside. He said the roots would carry his grief better than his bones ever could. The children had formed a choir of sorts, not trained, not disciplined, but full of noise and intention. They met beneath the largest elm and took turns leading. One girl always chose lullabies. Another shouted rhymes about dragons and honey. They sang off key. They danced. They laughed until they fell down. And when their voices lifted, even the elders found themselves pausing mid-task, hands still, hearts full. Old recipes were remembered and shared. Not with exact measurements, but with stories. "Add just enough, until it feels right," one woman would say, handing over a spoonful of spice. Meals became communal more often than not. Someone always had extra broth. Another had stale bread made new by the fire. They ate slowly, grateful, and after each meal someone always said, "That was enough." Time changed its shape. Days weren't measured in chores or miles. They were measured in moments, a butterfly landing on a thumb. The exact second a loaf cracked open in the oven. The echo of a name shouted from across a field and answered with joy. These became the clock's hands. An artist who had once travelled far returned home and painted on doors instead of canvases. She painted skies on the inside of closets, stars above headboards, rivers along hallway floors. Not everyone understood it, but no one painted over them. Her work was a reminder that even within four walls the world was still immense. A dog, once half wild and always distant, began lying in the middle of the square each afternoon. People stepped around it, careful not to disturb. Someone always left scraps, someone always scratched behind its ears. That dog became the village's heartbeat, resting in plain sight. And then there was the silence, not the empty kind, but the full one. The type that settles in when everyone is together, and no one needs to speak. Around fires, on hilltops, under blankets. That silence was not absence. It was presence. It was trust. By the 20th gathering of stars overhead, the people had begun to dream again. Not in fear, not in desperation, but in possibility. And that kind of dreaming, gentle, collective, brave, was the most powerful thing of all. By the 21st roll of sunrises, the pace of life had shifted into something almost poetic. Each step taken on the worn paths of the village was no longer a march away from danger, but a stroll through belonging. There was no formal declaration, no bell that announced the change, but if you watched carefully, how the elders leaned a little less on their canes, how the children shouted each other's names with more laughter than urgency, you could feel it in the very way the air moved between bodies. This place was breathing again, not with caution, but with calm. Everywhere, things bloomed where once they had merely endured. Weeds that had once been pulled with disdain were now left alone, allowed to grow wild and tangle with intention. People had learned that not everything messy is unwanted. In fact, some of the most stubborn plants had the most healing in their roots. A midwife taught others how to dry them properly. She said bitterness often hides medicine, and they believed her. A boy who couldn't sit still for lessons had taken to drawing chalk figures on the stone wall outside the baker's shop. Every morning a new creature would appear, sometimes a smiling goat, other times a winged man with trees for arms. No one erased them. People began greeting them, touching their outlines for luck before continuing their day. That wall, smudged and uneven, became a gallery of wonder, curated by a child who hadn't spoken more than 10 words the previous winter. The blacksmith's son started collecting rain in jars. He said each storm had a different song, and the water remembered it. He would line the jars on the window ledge and tilt them against his ear, as though listening to secrets trapped in glass. Others began doing the same. Soon shelves in homes across the village sparkled with reflections of the sky. The children called it bottled thunder. No one corrected them. One evening a pair of travellers came through, strangers by sight but not by spirit. They were weary, covered in the dust of too many roads. The villagers offered soup without questions. The travellers gave stories in return, tales of other places slowly recovering, distant towns finding their own way back from the edge. As they sat by the fire, even the most stoic villagers leaned in closer. They needed to hear that they were not the only ones climbing out of the dark. A man who had once lost everything took to carving walking sticks. He gave them away to those who needed balance, never charging a coin. Each was different. One had a bird carved at the top, another twined with a snake, a third inlaid with sea glass. He said he didn't make sticks. He made reminders that we all need something to lean on. The air held new fragrances too, the scent of sweat from honest work. The salt of preserved fish hung to dry. The sharp brightness of herbs burned for blessing. These smells layered over one another, not masking the past but building something stronger on top of it. The children began inventing new words, combinations of sounds that meant nothing but made perfect sense in their games. Fribber, one shouted, jumping over a stream. Blantu, another yelled in response. These were languages of joy, spontaneous, untranslatable, and wholly real to those who used them. Adults sometimes picked them up too, using the new words in jest, as if reclaiming the right to silliness. A woman who had never been known for her laughter now chuckled openly while tending her chickens. She said they had personalities, that each one told her jokes if you knew how to listen. One chicken, a scruffy creature with lopsided feathers, became a favourite among the children. They named him Sir Cluckles, and it stuck. On the longest day of the week, the villagers created something new. A moment where no work was done, not a holiday, just an hour. An hour of shared quiet. People sat in thresholds, leaned against fences, lay in fields. They didn't call it anything, didn't need to. It was a breath they all took together. An agreement without words, to rest, just because they could. Stories spread again, this time without the weight of survival behind them. Someone told of a fox that visited her window every third night, always blinking once before trotting away. Another spoke of dreams filled with golden rivers. They didn't argue about facts. Truth now came in many shapes, and there they respected each one. At the edge of the forest, someone hung wind chimes made of broken utensils and string. They clattered and rang whenever the breeze picked up. People began leaving little gifts beneath them. Dried flowers, painted rocks, small ribbons. No one asked who started it. It didn't matter. The sound reminded them that even broken things could make music. The bell, once used to call for danger or to mourn the dead, was rung on purpose for laughter. One boy was dared to ring it after making the others laugh so hard they fell over. He did, and no one was angry. They laughed harder. From that day, a new tradition began. If someone made others laugh until tears came, they were allowed to ring the bell. It echoed joy instead of sorrow now. There was no map to mark their recovery, no ceremony to name the moment it had turned. But in the eyes of the people, in the stretch of their shadows, in the way hands found each other easily now, you could tell they were no longer waiting for life to begin again. It already had. The village had not forgotten what it endured, but it had learned to shape what remained into something not just livable, but luminous. a candle held in steady hands, a roof patched with care, a word spoken at just the right time. By the 22nd passage of moon and sun, something profound had settled into the roots of the place, into the timbers of every home, the grain of every plank, the memory of each tree that bordered the village edge. It wasn't something anyone pointed to, it wasn't marked on any paper or spoken aloud with certainty, but it was there, unmistakably. A current, low and slow, running beneath every routine act of living. It was something like peace, but older, and harder earned. You could see it in how people greeted the day, not rushing to beat the cold or fearing the sky's temperament, but stepping outside to stretch, to listen, to greet the wind like an old companion. Some still woke early out of habit, but now they lingered longer before beginning their tasks. They watched the colours shift over the distant hills. They noticed the way mist clung to branches. The day had become something to witness, not just survive. In one small kitchen, a girl with a crooked grin began writing messages on her bread crusts, little poems, funny jokes, questions meant to make someone smile. She left them wrapped in cloth at doorsteps. No one knew who she was at first, but the village caught on. People began answering. Some left their own crust notes in return. It was a conversation carried by flour and ink, passed without names, bound by goodwill. A once bitter man who had kept to himself for years started offering free sharpening of tools. His hands, rough with time, moved like he remembered more than he let on. He never smiled while he worked, but his eyes softened. People said their tools cut better than ever, but more importantly, they returned home feeling seen. He gave edge not just to iron, but to tired spirits. The children had taken over the clearing near the forest and turned it into their secret village. Twigs became fences, stones, little homes. Leaves were blankets, feathers their flags. They gave themselves titles: Captain of Mud, Keeper of Wind, Lady of the Hollow Log. No adult interrupted. Some watched from a distance, remembering the smell of soil beneath their own nails long ago. One evening, a man who'd long stopped believing in anything looked at the stars and whispered a name. No one heard him, but the name hung there in the cool air like breath not yet vanished. After that, he began tending the community lanterns. Every night before darkness settled fully, he lit them one by one. He didn't speak, but the light was his language. At the pond, frogs returned. Their songs filled the twilight, and no one wished them quiet. On warm days, families came to sit by the shore with feet in the water. The stillness held weight, not of sorrow anymore, but of comfort. The reflections were clearer now, and when the wind broke them, no one mourned the ripple. A woman who had forgotten how to dance remembered. It came in her feet first. A rhythm while sweeping, a sway while shelling peas. One afternoon, as music drifted from a cracked window, she stepped into the square and let herself move. Not gracefully, not with elegance, but freely. Others joined her. Not a performance, just a reunion of bodies and rhythm. There was an orchard where the trees had almost been abandoned. The frost had taken many of them, but a few remained. A boy with a quiet spirit began to speak to them, not loudly, just in passing. He told them what the weather was doing. He thanked them for their shade. In the spring, one tree bloomed early, pink and defiant. That tree became sacred. People painted their doors bright colours, not for visitors, but for themselves. Yellows, greens, blues that had not been seen in years. It wasn't coordinated. It didn't match. But the village gleamed now, patchwork and proud, like a quilt of old souls stitched together with pigment and purpose. The well, once a place of groaning buckets and quick footsteps, became a meeting spot. A boy played tunes on an old whistle nearby. A girl read stories aloud as people gathered for water. Conversations bubbled up between strangers, and friendships began over shared jugs. What had once been a chore became an excuse to linger. An elder took up the task of storytelling again. Not just history, but the kind of stories that stretched between truth and fable. He told of invisible foxes who guarded dreams, of owls who spoke warnings only children could hear. People came not to check stark facts, but to feel something stir within them. A kind of magic returned, not the kind with spells, but the kind born of wonder. A fence that had divided two families for years came down. No announcement, no reason given. One morning it was simply gone. In its place stood a garden, half planted by one family, tended by the other. No one spoke of the old argument again. They just watered each other's rows and shared the shade when the sun got too high. A musician who had lost the strength to play found joy in teaching again. He couldn't hold the instrument for long, but he showed others how to listen. "Don't chase the note," he said once. "Let it find you." His students grew, and one day they played together at dusk. The notes were uneven, raw, real. No one clapped when they finished. They just stood hushed and let the last echo linger. At the edge of the village, where wild grass met the edge of tilled fields, someone began stacking stones, one atop another, gently balanced. Each morning there were more, some fell, others were rebuilt. Children left feathers in their crevices. Adults whispered to them like confessionals. Those stones became prayers shaped by gravity. And in the middle of it all, people started singing again. Not in choirs, not in performances, but while doing things. Hanging laundry, feeding goats, walking home. The melodies weren't precise, they weren't meant for anyone but the singer. But from house to house, path to path, song flowed like a stream through their days. By the 23rd passage of dusk into dawn, it was no longer just what the villagers did that marked their resilience, it was how they did it. The hands that once trembled while securing latches now moved with surety, not because the danger had vanished, but because fear no longer dictated their every move. Fear had become a guest, not a ruler. It still visited now and then, but it no longer held the keys. There was a man who for seasons had spoken to no one but the crows. Some said he'd gone strange, others said he understood things others couldn't. But one morning he arrived in the square holding a basket of black feathers. He handed them out one by one to the children. Not a word spoken, just the offering. The children tucked them behind ears, into pockets, under hats. They called them sky whispers. The man nodded once, then walked back to the trees. He smiled for the first time in years. The baker, long known for his silence and burnt crusts, began shaping his dough into birds, stars and waves. Bread became more than sustenance. It became sculpture. He never explained the change, but customers lingered longer, watched as he worked, sometimes forgetting to ask for anything at all. They just stood there, soothed by the rhythm of kneading and the perfume of yeast rising through stone walls. In the loft of a home where 4 generations had once lived, and now only one remained, a girl began collecting dust in jars. Not out of obsession, but reverence. "This is from the corner where Grandpa used to whistle," she'd say, "and this one caught the sunbeam that landed on my sister's hair." It made no sense to anyone else. But in her heart, she was archiving memory, preserving stillness, bottling what time had left behind. One child built a contraption from sticks, strings and wheels salvaged from broken carts. He didn't know what it did, neither did anyone else, but it spun and creaked and rang in the wind like an orchestra of misfit parts. It stood near the mill, and soon villagers began placing small notes in it, messages to no one and everyone, confessions, blessings, nonsense poems. The machine didn't judge, it simply received. A dog that had wandered into the village during the hardest days, scrawny, limping, wary, now lay in the chapel doorway. No one dared remove it. They said it chose who sat near it. A boy with nightmares, a widow with sore knees, a father with too many sons lost. The dog's eyes held oceans. People whispered that it had once been a man. Others said it was an angel that preferred paws. Either way, it listened better than most. At the market, someone began trading smiles instead of goods. You gave one, you got one. It became a rule. A man tried to barter without one and was handed a mirror. "Try again," the vendor said gently. The man tried. It was weak, half-hearted, but it grew. By the end of the week, the man had teeth in his grin and wrinkles he didn't mind showing. A seamstress stitched patterns into clothing that weren't for beauty, but protection. Spirals that deflected grief. Dots that caught dreams. Lines that reminded you of your own name. She said thread could carry intention, like prayer through fibre. Those who wore her clothes walked taller even if the fabric was coarse. In the evenings, people gathered at the highest ridge. Not every night, just when the sky seemed to call them. They didn't speak much, some brought flutes. Others carried baskets with berries or candles. A girl once sang a lullaby to the clouds. The sound lingered long after she fell asleep on her mother's lap. That ridge became a page where the village wrote itself in silence. And the children began to build boats from bark and string and set them adrift in the river. Some held candles, others carried painted stones. They said each boat held a hope or a secret. No one followed them downstream. The not knowing was the gift. Let the current carry what it would. Let it decide what returned. One woman started growing vines up her home's outer walls. She said they were her fingers reaching to hug the sky. By summer's height, her house was half swallowed in green. Birds nested in her shutters. Butterflies gathered like petals. She laughed when someone called it overgrown. "I've been overgrown for years," she replied. A travelling tinker passed through, offering trinkets that didn't do much. Wooden frogs that clicked, spinning tops that refused to stop, stones that hummed under sunlight. He asked nothing in return. "Take what calls to you," he said. And they did. He left before dawn without farewell, but his things remained, and the joy he scattered took root in every hand that held them. There was a man who had once written songs for lovers. After losing his own, he stopped, but one evening he hummed again, then sang, not of love, but of soil and stone, of shadow and fire. His voice cracked. It didn't matter. Those around him wept and smiled in equal measure. Loss had taught him a new kind of melody, one that stitched together the quiet parts of the soul. A child asked her grandfather, "What is a hero?" He didn't reply with names or tales of war. He just pointed to the woman planting seeds in the hard earth. "Someone who keeps going, Remnobding," he said. The child nodded and drew a picture of the woman with a crown made of dandelions. A man began placing candles in tree knots. No one knew why. At night, when the wind was soft and the moon bold, you could see the forest blink back at you. Some thought it was eerie, others found comfort in it. The forest had eyes now, eyes that glowed gently like memory. Villagers began recording time not in days or weeks, but in experiences. The week of the triple rainbow, they'd say, or since the fox slept on the chapel step. The calendar of the heart replaced the one nailed to the chapel door. It made more sense to live by feeling than by count. And among all this, no one claimed leadership. No single voice rose above the rest. It was a tide, not a tower. A woven net of voices, hands, glances, gestures. Their strength was not in one, but in the many who dared to show up again and again, not knowing what tomorrow held but walking toward it anyway. By the 24th full sweep of the moon over their skies, the rhythm of life had begun to feel like music, unwritten, unsung, but deeply understood. It wasn't a song they could recite, yet they moved in time with it. Not because they planned to, but because every breath, every glance, every step had somehow begun to flow with something greater than the sum of their individual lives. They weren't just surviving, they were slowly and quietly creating. In the centre of the village, the cobblestone paths had worn smoother from the constant shuffle of lives returning to normal. Not the old version of normal, but a new one born of patience. Children skipped across those stones now without thinking of frostbitten feet or broken wagons. The stones, silent and grey, remembered everything, but held no grudges. They simply bore the weight of those who walked them. One man, once known only for his silence and his bitterness, began hanging small wind charms from the eaves of homes, not just his own, but everyone's. Made from bones, bits of glass, and hollow reeds, they chimed when the wind wandered by. At first, villagers removed them. Then they started keeping them. Some added ribbons, others tied notes. Soon the soft music of moving air was constant, as though the wind itself was finally learning to sing in harmony with the earth. An elderly woman who had once refused to leave her doorstep began growing mint and lavender in broken clay pots. Her fingers shook when she watered them, but not from fear, just age. Every so often she plucked leaves and gave them away. "For your tea," she'd whisper, even if the receiver hadn't asked for anything. She wasn't just handing out herbs, she was offering calm in a cup. At the edge of the stream, a boy began building bridges out of twigs. Not to cross, too small for that, but just to build. He said the animals needed them. Rabbits, birds, even the ants. The adults laughed, but gently, some even joined in. Tiny bridges soon dotted the banks, like invitations to something unseen. Perhaps the animals never used them, but the people did, if not with feet, then with imagination. The baker's daughter had a habit of placing little bundles of sugar and dried fruit beneath doorsteps. No one ever caught her doing it. But every few days, a tiny package appeared wrapped in cloth or wax paper. Some said she was trying to sweeten the world, one doorstep at a time. Others said she was practicing magic. No one ever found a reason to stop her. One night, after a long day of labour and little rest, someone dragged a bench into the middle of the square and lay flat on it, arms stretched wide, eyes closed to the stars. No one disturbed them. Instead, others brought pillows, blankets, candles. They called it the pause. After that, every fortnight, villagers gathered not to speak or plan or work, but just to be, breathing in sync, dreaming with eyes open, a shared hush. An artist who had never quite fit in returned from the woods one day with their arms full of ash and charcoal. They began sketching on stones, tree bark, walled walls, images of fire turning to rain, of wolves curled beside sheep, of hearts blooming out of soil. These weren't pretty pictures. They were raw and strange and arresting, but they spoke something ancient, something that stirred just beneath the ribs. The villagers didn't always understand the images, but they began guarding them, washing them when rain tried to smear the lines, repairing chipped stones so the pictures would remain. One morning the wind shifted, not just in direction but in tone. It carried with it a scent from far away, pine, salt, something unfamiliar but warm. People stopped what they were doing, even the goats froze mid-chew. A traveller was coming, not one they feared, but one who felt familiar before they even arrived. By dusk, the visitor appeared, wrapped in layers of cloth the colour of dusk. They spoke little but listened well. They traded the spices, tales of distant shores and stories stitched into fabric. The village welcomed them as if they had been expected. A young girl with a love for shadow began crafting silhouettes out of paper and sticking them in corners, figures of dancing women, leaping animals, trees with faces. At night, with candlelight, they came to life on the walls. She called them the Watchers. Others began making their own. Soon homes were filled with silent companions that flickered and stretched with the light. They reminded people that even the darkest parts of life could hold stories. There was a man who hadn't sung in decades, not since his brother vanished one winter and never returned. One evening, alone in the woods gathering firewood, he began to hum, not out of joy, but out of surrender. He didn't even realize he was doing it until the birds answered. That night, he returned home and sang softly to the fire. The flames danced higher as if listening. A woman began weaving rugs from scraps of torn cloth, each one telling a different story. Not with words, but with pattern. One was for grief, another for a wedding never held, a third for laughter that came back when no one expected it. People came not just to buy them, but to sit with her while she worked, to add their stories to the warp and weft. An elder whose memory had started to fade asked a child to follow them and remember for them. Each day they walked together. The child noted every word, every tree pointed at, every humming tune. In time, the child became a living library, holding not just facts, but feelings. And when the elder could no longer speak, the child sat beside them and whispered the memories back. Every door in the village began to open wider, not physically, though some did hang new hinges, but metaphorically. Invitations came more freely. Meals were offered without asking. Someone began delivering kind words tucked in old books. Another painted stones with compliments and left them in surprising places. There was no system, just a collective pull toward light. And still, even amid all this newness, the winter's echo remained. But it no longer threatened. It had become like the ring left in a cup long after the tea is gone, a reminder of what was once there and of what was endured. People still spoke of it in whispers, sometimes in tears, but now they did so while holding hands, not while hiding. In the forest, flowers bloomed in a pattern no one remembered planting, a circle wide and perfect. Some said it was the earth's way of thanking them for staying. Others believed it was a portal. A few just called it beautiful and sat in the centre to breathe. Whatever its origin, it became sacred, protected, celebrated. And so it continued. The story of a place not rebuilt in haste, but regrown with the slowness of trust. Each moment, each gesture, each decision made without certainty, but with care. The kind of care that doesn't demand recognition, that doesn't come from obligation, but that rises from the deep knowing that life, no matter how broken, is always waiting to be cradled again. By the time 25 full cycles of the moon had passed over the thatched rooftops and winding paths of that village, what once felt fragile now felt sacred. Not in the way temples or rituals are revered, but in the way a heartbeat becomes holy after you've feared it might stop. The quiet was no longer ominous. It had become a companion. The cracks in walls no longer meant things were falling apart. They meant something had endured the weight and kept standing. A boy who had once been too afraid to speak above a whisper now told long stories to anyone who'd listen. Not stories of dragons or kings, but stories of puddles and trees and the way sunlight hit a stone just right on a certain afternoon. People gathered around him, not for the tales themselves, but because they reminded them how much beauty hides in things we forget to see. He wasn't a storyteller. He was a mirror, reflecting back the world in tiny marvels. One woman who had lost her entire family during the harshest winter took to lighting a small candle in the hollow of a tree every morning before sunrise. She never said a word about it, but one by one, others began to follow her, not with questions or comments, just with quiet footsteps and their own flames. The grove became a forest of light, flickering softly in the early dark. Grief didn't vanish there. It sat among the roots, warmed by kindness, no longer frozen in silence. A man who had once carved tools began shaping birds from wood. Not realistic ones. His birds had too many wings or eyes that gleamed like marbles. He placed them in the tree branches and atop fence posts. Some villagers believed they brought good dreams. Others said they kept sorrow away. He never said what they were for. He just carved, whittled, placed and smiled as he walked home, his pockets full of shavings and peace. In the fields, women began braiding their hair with bits of thread. Gold, red, green, each colour meaning something only they understood. The threads caught the sunlight as they worked, bending low over vegetables that had once struggled to grow. The earth, now softened and forgiving, gave back more willingly than before. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the hope that soaked into the soil along with it. Either way, the crops stood taller, and so did those who tended them. A teenager began collecting echoes. He'd cup his hands around a word someone had just spoken and repeat it, softly like a prayer. He didn't do it to annoy or mimic. He did it to preserve. Words disappear too fast, he once said. I want them to last a little longer. People began repeating their own words sometimes, softly to themselves, wondering which ones might be worth keeping. The well in the centre of the square had always been known for its depth, but now people began throwing in tokens, not to wish for anything, but to let things go. A thread from a shirt worn during a bad year, a pebble from the spot where something painful had happened, a leaf they picked up on the day they heard terrible news. No one asked what the objects meant, but the water took them gently, holding them in silence. One girl kept a book of drawings that had no titles and no order. A house split in half with flowers growing inside, a goat with wings, a ladder reaching into a bowl of stars. She never explained what any of it meant, but she let others turn the pages, and often they'd find an image that felt like something they didn't know they needed. The book became a shared map to feelings too complex to describe. The bell tower, once only used to signal danger or death, now chimed whenever someone returned from a long journey. It was a way to say, you made it. We see you. One night, a man came back after 5 seasons away, broken shoes and tired eyes. Before he even reached the gates, the bell rang, slow and full, the sound floated through every home like a warm breath. He cried before anyone spoke to him. A woman who used to braid straw into baskets began weaving words into them. Tiny letters burned into the rim. Some were messages of courage, others were questions. Some were just single words, still, rise, enough. People began trading them like they were coins, holding them close, not for what they carried, but for how they made the holder feel less alone. Children invented a game where you had to walk from one end of the square to the other without stepping on any cracks. Not because they thought it would bring bad luck, but because the game made them careful, attentive, present. Adults watched them, amused at first, then gradually joined in. It became a weekly ritual, barefoot, laughing, cautious not to disturb the ground too much, as if acknowledging it had carried them far enough already. A man found a stone shaped like a heart and left it by the chapel door. The next day someone placed a feather next to it, then a shell, then a braid of grass. The small collection remained, unmoved by wind or curiosity. It was never discussed. But people passed it slowly, bowing slightly, as if it had become a shrine to something unnamed but universally felt. Someone began carving names into the underside of benches, people who had once lived, who had left or died or simply vanished. Not to mourn them, but to honour them quietly, to give them a place to rest. The carvings were hidden unless you looked carefully, but once you found them, you never sat the same way again. One night, without warning, the stars fell. Not all of them, just a few, enough to catch attention. Children ran to catch them in baskets. Adults watched with wide eyes, like seeing the sky cry in reverse. The next morning, someone placed a drawing of it on the chapel wall. Others added poems. The wall became a canvas of wonder, a place to hang amazement without needing a reason. An old woman began carrying pebbles in her apron, one for each day she'd felt strong. She didn't speak of the days she hadn't, but you could tell by the weight of her steps when the load was heavier. Still she walked. Still she smiled. She gave out pebbles to those who looked like they were running low on strength. No questions, just the stone in your palm and her hand brushing yours like wind through wheat. And in all this, these strange, quiet, beautiful customs, there grew something unspoken, a reverence for the ordinary, a sacredness in the daily. The mundane, no longer dull, had become their shared sanctuary. They had learned, not by doctrine or instruction, but through repetition and grace, that survival doesn't mean returning to what was. It means becoming something new without forgetting what shaped you. As the 26th circle of seasons turned over the village, time itself seemed to walk with a slower, more deliberate gait. Gone was the urgency that used to sit behind every door like a waiting storm. In its place now sat something gentler, something like gratitude draped in quiet observation. Not every wound had closed, but most had stopped bleeding. Not every heart had mended, but many beat with a steadiness that once seemed impossible. At the edge of the woods, a boy had taken to tying bits of red thread around branches. He never told anyone why. Some thought he was tracing a path for someone he missed. Others said he was trying to sew the forest back together, one knot at a time. The threads fluttered in the wind like whispers. Over time, others joined him. Blue for hope, green for forgiveness, white for days they wanted to remember. The forest began to speak in colour. In one home, an old woman spent her mornings polishing spoons. Not because they were dirty, but because they reflected light in a way she found comforting. She lined them on her windowsill and watched as the sun danced across them throughout the day. Visitors began bringing her spoons of their own, some bent, some rusted, some shiny. She never turned one away. They weren't utensils anymore. They were stories she could hold in her hands. The carpenter, who once only built tables and chairs, began crafting doors. Not just for homes, but for trees, for rocks, for the sides of hills. Tiny wooden doors that didn't open, placed where only the curious would find them. For the ones who left and might want to return, he said when asked. He left no names, just hinges and hope. One morning, the wind brought the smell of salt, even though the sea was days away. A woman who had never seen the ocean stood outside her home with her eyes closed and a smile on her face. "It smells like beginning," she whispered. Children ran through the village pretending to be waves, laughing and tossing flower petals like foam. That day they called the village a beach, even if it never touched a drop of salt water. The baker started leaving empty baskets outside his shop. He didn't ask for payment anymore. People took what they needed and left what they could. Some left berries, others tucked in notes of encouragement. One child placed a stone shaped like a heart. The baskets were never empty for long. Kindness, it turned out, was just as filling as bread. In the clearing where the oldest tree stood, someone began singing every morning at dawn. They weren't trained. The voice cracked, wavered, broke in places, but it never stopped. The songs were made up, never the same twice. People came to listen, not for melody, but for meaning. The tree, once just a tree, became something else. A stage, a confessional, a sacred ear. A girl who'd always been shy started writing messages on leaves and letting them float down the river. She didn't care who read them. She only wanted the words to go somewhere. One man found one miles downstream and walked all the way to the village just to say thank you. She never told him which leaf was hers. It didn't matter. Someone started planting flowers in old boots. Another placed candles in empty jars. A third carved tiny animals out of soap and left them on windowsills. None of these things had purpose in the traditional sense. Yet they filled the village with a kind of magic that made even the most hardened visitor stop and soften. On a foggy morning, the oldest resident of the village took a walk without a cane for the first time in years. People noticed but didn't make a fuss. Instead, one child quietly walked beside her, offering only silence and presence. She reached the edge of the square and looked around like seeing it all for the first time. "It's grown up," she said softly. "So have we." At the riverbank, someone placed smooth stones in a perfect spiral. No one knew who. Each day the spiral grew. One morning it had vanished, washed away by the rain. Instead of sadness, people began placing flowers where the stones had been. Not as a replacement, but as a continuation. As if saying nothing is lost, only transformed. A man who had once feared the night now walked it with ease. He said stars were braver than they looked. He took to writing small verses on bark and hanging them from lantern posts. By morning they were often gone, some taken, some blown away. It didn't matter. He called them thought feathers, things too light to keep, but too beautiful to waste. In a corner of the village where few ventured, a woman began painting windows, not with landscapes, but with shapes and colours that had no names. Swirls, bursts, strange figures dancing across the glass. Her house glowed with every sunset, like a lantern from within. People started bringing her scraps of cloth, asking her to paint them too. Soon half the village wore colour like armour. And still, in the spaces between all this, there was quiet. Not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that arrives with trust. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of presence. The kind of silence that listens back. A man carved the word "stay" into a tree trunk on the path out of the village. He didn't know why. Maybe it was for someone who needed a reason to turn around. Or maybe it was for himself. Either way, the word stayed there, growing moss but never disappearing. Sometimes that single word was all someone needed. A woman began collecting laughter, not in bottles or books, but in memory. She'd listen carefully during gatherings, catch the moment when laughter peaked, and hold it in her heart like a photograph. That one sounded like bells, she'd say. Or, that one had sunshine in it. People began laughing more, just so she could have something to hold. And beneath it all, the earth kept turning, the days kept unfolding, and the village kept becoming. Not better, not perfect, just truer. They weren't chasing what was lost anymore. They were building what had never been before. By the 27th sweep of seasons through the sky above the village, the people no longer measured life by hardship. There had been too much of that already, etched in the wood of their doorframes, carried in the lines of their faces, folded into the lullabies that were sung to children who hadn't yet learned how cold the world could be. But something had shifted. They were no longer living to avoid pain. They were living because life had finally shown them it could be something more. There was a boy who began collecting sounds. Not recordings, he had no machine for that. Tineas, just memories. He'd sit beside streams and memorize how the water lapped against stone. He'd follow wind through tall grass, studying its patterns. He claimed to remember what the moon sounded like when it rose on a still night. Some thought he was strange. Others envied his attention to the world. He wasn't just listening. He was communing with something larger than himself. A woman whose hands were always stained with berry juice took to leaving jars of jam on random steps. Not labelled, not claimed, just there, waiting to be opened and tasted. Some jars held strawberry, others had wild plum or rosehip. One day someone found a jar with a single spoonful and a note that read, "For when sweet things feel distant." People started leaving notes in return, tucked under the jar lids. The village became a conversation made of sugar and ink. At the foot of an old oak tree, a man who had once been a soldier planted herbs. He said the ground there needed healing. He didn't speak much, but when he did, he told stories not of battles, but of silence. The kind that comes after noise so loud it empties the soul. His garden grew tall and wild, and people came to sit in its shade not to learn anything, but to remember how to be still again. There was a child who painted doorsteps with chalk symbols no one understood. Swirls, stars, geometric lines like dancing roots. The rain would wash them away, but she always returned, giggling and drawing them again. When asked why, she said, "They are for the invisible ones who walk at night, so they know we're friendly." After that, some adults began drawing their own marks. The village became a tapestry of welcome for all that could not be seen. A man with failing eyesight began walking with a bell tied to his wrist. Not to ask for help, but to let the world know he was near. "So it doesn't surprise me," he explained with a chuckle. Children began tying bells to their ankles, skipping through the fields, chiming like laughter. The sound became a rhythm of reassurance, a gentle signal that no one was ever truly alone in their steps. In the evenings, a group gathered by the river not to talk or sing or celebrate, but to sit in shared silence. No one organised it. No one spoke of it. It just happened. Some brought candles. Others sat with arms wrapped around knees, eyes closed. They faced the water as if it held answers to questions they hadn't found words for. That place became sacred without ever being named. A woman who'd once been terrified of storms began dancing in the rain. The first time she was soaked through before anyone realised what she was doing, but she didn't stop. She twirled and laughed until the sky calmed down. After that, others joined her. Some brought tambourines. Others simply stood in the downpour with open palms, faces tilted upward. They called it a celebration, not of the storm, but of surviving it. An old man took to placing acorns in villagers' pockets when they weren't looking. He called them promises. He said trees don't grow overnight, and neither do people. But one day, when no one's watching, roots take hold. Some planted theirs, some kept them in jars. One girl wore hers on a necklace. It became a quiet game. Where would your promise grow? In a forgotten corner of the village, someone began writing wishes on bits of parchment and pinning them to a wall. Soon the wall was covered, pages fluttering like wings in the wind. Some were silly, some were heartbreakingly sincere. A wish for a sister to return, a hope for one more warm winter, a dream of flying. The wall never collapsed under the weight of longing. If anything, it stood taller. There was a woman who sang lullabies to her garden. Tomatoes, carrots, beans, none grew larger than others, but the plants leaned toward her voice like it was sunlight. Neighbours swore the vegetables tasted better. She said she wasn't sure if the plants needed the songs or if she did. Either way, she kept singing. The carpenter began shaping benches that curved like waves. He said sitting should feel like floating. Each bench was placed where a moment of rest was needed, but often overlooked, by the well, under the whispering tree, beside the crooked fence. One child climbed onto one and declared it a boat. Others followed. The benches became ships, sanctuaries, stages. A woman who used to hide her face behind a scarf began painting it instead. Every day a new design. Flowers, stars, mountains. One day it bore nothing but a single blue line, like a river flowing across her cheek. When someone asked her why, she smiled and said, "Today, I am water." The next day she wore no scarf at all. A man who had spent decades building walls around his garden began tearing them down. He said the vegetables wanted to see the world. Strangers began wandering in, not to steal, but to admire. Some left notes of thanks. Others helped pull weeds. What had once been his sanctuary became a shared haven. Children began mapping the stars on their ceilings using bits of glowing stone and paint that caught moonlight. They made up names for constellations: the laughing goat, the whispering spoon, the hug. Adults found themselves peeking in at night, tracing the imaginary skies, finding comfort in their invented cosmos. And somehow in the midst of all this blooming of quiet, this ritual of kindness, the villagers began to realise something extraordinary. They weren't waiting for life to return to what it had been before the hard years. They no longer clung to memories of warmth that once was. Instead, they were inventing a new kind of warmth, one not dependent on seasons or supplies, but on each other. When the 28th cycle of frost and thaw passed over the village like a breath held and finally released, the people had stopped counting days as milestones. It was no longer about marking time. It was about tasting it, letting each morning unfold without prediction and each evening settle without resistance. They had grown into the kind of community that didn't announce its growth. It simply unfolded, quietly, like petals unwrapping under moonlight. A boy who had once feared the dark took to walking at dusk, guiding others with a lantern made from an old birdcage. Inside, instead of a candle, he'd place fireflies caught gently and let go when the sun returned. Some nights they flickered brighter than stars. He didn't call it light. He called it companionship. The kind that glows and doesn't burn, he once said, handing a friend a second lantern just in case. One woman began a tradition of placing cups of warm water by the window each night, murmuring blessings into the steam. She said it gave the cold something to sip, made the wind feel welcome. No one mocked her. Instead, more windows lit up with little cups and tiny trails of vapour. Some added cinnamon. Others floated petals. One child placed a pebble in his, for weight, he said, so the wish wouldn't float away. A craftsman began making whistles shaped like birds. They didn't sound like birds, not really. but they sounded like freedom, like the echo of a hilltop shout. People wore them around their necks, not as jewellery, but as reminders that they had a voice. That sound could carry far, that joy could fit inside breath. In the open square, someone laid out a circle of blankets and invited anyone passing to sit. "Only if you're feeling nothing in particular, Bdori," the sign said. "Not sad, not excited, just in between." The circle filled slowly. A woman knitting, a man with his eyes closed, a boy drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. It became a sanctuary for the undefined, where not knowing how you felt was enough. A man who once travelled far and returned weary began reading stories aloud at sunset. Not old tales, but ones he made up as he went. No endings, no heroes, just wandering thoughts spoken into air. He'd sit on a bench, let his voice drift, and anyone nearby could listen or not. Some days it was just him and the wind. Other days, people came early to hear how a story with no plan could still take you somewhere worth going. The butcher began wrapping packages in paper, printed with poems, not his own, snippets he overheard, fragments found scribbled on benches, lines left behind in letters. One package read, "What if love is just the courage to keep opening doors?" Another, "The sky never asks if it's allowed to change." No one threw the paper away. A girl planted a single sunflower in a cracked vase atop the well. It shouldn't have grown, yet it reached toward the sun every day like it had nothing but faith. When it bloomed, people left notes tied to its stem, gratitudes, confessions, questions. When it wilted, they buried its seeds beneath the chapel eaves. The next spring, 20 sunflowers bloomed. None of them asked permission. There was a couple who hadn't spoken since a fight long forgotten. One morning, the woman left a basket of apples outside the man's home. The next day he carved a wooden spoon and left it by her doorstep. No words passed. But that winter they were seen walking together, silently, side by side, the kind of closeness only repaired by time and gestures without explanation. In a corner where weeds once grew wild, children built a spiral path of smooth stones. They called it the thinking maze. You didn't walk it to get anywhere. You walked it to forget where you were going. Adults laughed at first, then tried it. One woman walked the spiral every day for a month and said it helped her remember who she was before the world grew loud. Someone placed a mirror beside the old tree stump where travellers often rested. Etched into the glass were the words, "See who stayed." People paused, expecting to see only themselves. But what they saw was the wear in their eyes, the fire still smouldering behind them. They didn't look away. They nodded at their own reflection, as if to say, "Yes, you're still here." One girl began leaving questions around the village written in chalk. "What did you dream last night? When was the last time you forgave yourself? What colour does loneliness feel like?" No one erased them. People began writing answers beneath them. Some single words, some entire paragraphs. The village became a conversation that never stopped. The shoemaker began adding tiny stitched messages into the soles of his boots, not meant to be read, meant to be felt. He said walking was holy and deserved prayer underfoot. Some boots whispered, "Safe journey." Others whispered, "Stand tall." He said if your feet were loved, your heart might follow. A boy with a stutter learned to sing. Not on purpose, it just happened one day while feeding the birds. The song came out whole, no hesitation. People heard and began to hum with him. He sang in the bakery, in the chapel, at the edge of the stream. Words, when sung, stopped breaking. His voice became a path and others began to walk it. An elder took to weaving blankets made of old clothes. She didn't ask for donations. People brought them anyway. Shirts worn through, skirts no longer needed. Bits of childhoods faded but not forgotten. Each blanket held dozens of lives stitched together. They weren't beautiful in the usual sense, but people wrapped themselves in them like armour. There was a dog that wandered into the village, thin and limping. Instead of naming it, people gave it words. One day it was courage, the next day hope, then stillness. It responded to all of them. It slept in doorways beside the chapel, at the riverbank. When it passed, villagers placed their favourite word on a stone and left it in the clearing. The ground there never froze again. The bell ringer, once tasked only with marking time or sounding alarms, began ringing for joy. Not scheduled, not regular, just when he felt the need. A birth, a kiss, a beautiful cloud. One morning he rang for no reason, and people stepped outside just to hear it. The sky was grey, the wind mild. Nothing remarkable, except the realization that they didn't need a reason to mark something as sacred. And through it all, no one kept score. No one counted the good deeds or weighed them against the sorrows. They didn't tally kindness or compare pain. They simply lived like roots pushing deeper into soil they once thought was barren. Now it bloomed beneath their every step. By the 29th passage of seasons across their sky, the village no longer flinched when the air turned cold. The first chill of winter used to make people brace themselves, clench jaws and prepare for hardship. But now the frost brought with it a quiet hush, a reminder that silence too could be comforting. They didn't dread the snow. They welcomed it like a familiar traveller returning after a long absence, one who no longer had the power to frighten them. One morning, before sunrise, a woman took a single candle to the hilltop and lit it as the sky began to change colour. She said it was for the ones they no longer spoke of, the ones who had faded from memory like fog from the valley. Her candle stayed lit through the wind, a small defiance against forgetfulness. The next morning others followed. A row of flickering flames began to dot the hill each dawn, not to mourn, but to remember that even absence deserves acknowledgement. A young boy, who had spent most of his life with a limp, found solace in making kites. Not to fly them, his fingers trembled too much to control their dance in the sky. Instead, he gave them away. "Let the wind carry what I can't," he would say. His kites were strange, made of feathers and bark, stitched with thread from old cloaks. They flew unevenly like laughter echoing off a crooked wall, but they flew all the same. When they rose, villagers looked up and remembered that grace didn't always require symmetry. In the far end of the market, an elder, who rarely spoke, took up the habit of writing single words on folded pieces of parchment. He left them on crates, in bread baskets, undercut. Words like mend, still, brave, soft. He never claimed them. But slowly the village began collecting them, slipping the words into pockets, hanging them near beds, tucking them inside letters. The words weren't advice, they were anchors. There was a tree near the well that had been scarred by lightning years ago, never blossomed again, but it stood tall, its bark blackened but proud. A girl began hanging bits of glass from its limbs, broken jars, cracked marbles, chips of coloured good window. When the sun hit them just right, they shimmered like stars caught mid-fall. The tree had become a lighthouse in the centre of the village, not guiding ships, but illuminating the fact that wounds could glow too. In the corner of the bakery, someone placed a bowl of stones. Each stone had a single word scratched into it. Not polished words, rough, jagged etchings. Try, pause, wait, begin. Anyone could take one. Anyone could leave one. Some people carried them for weeks before returning them. Others never brought them back. No one asked questions. The bowl never emptied. It was as if the stones found their way home on their own. A woman who had never danced in her life began twirling through the snow one afternoon. Her skirts lifted with the wind, and for a moment it looked as though she was weightless. Children joined her, slipping and laughing, their joy echoing through alleyways. Snow, which once symbolised despair, now held the rhythm of play. Even the elders chuckled as flakes landed on their shoulders like old friends tapping hello. An old man began carving tiny faces into firewood. Not angry faces, not smiling ones either, just honest. When burned, the logs seemed to breathe. "Let the flame know who it's holding," he'd say. It wasn't eerie, it was reverent, as though even the pieces that fueled warmth deserved to be recognised as once whole things. The fire didn't just heat homes anymore, it held memory. A girl began drawing maps of places that didn't exist. Islands shaped like hands, mountains named after emotions, rivers that flowed upward. People began requesting them. "Draw the place I dream of," someone said. "Make a land for regrets," said another. She obliged. Her maps were tacked onto walls, folded into letters, placed beneath pillows. Not because they showed the way, but because they reminded people that direction can begin from within. The river froze one morning, a smooth mirror stretching between banks. Instead of despair, the villagers brought lanterns and skated in their boots, tracing spirals and arcs across its surface. One woman fell and laughed so hard she cried. A man lifted her and whispered something about the joy of falling in safe places. Someone played a flute. The river, which once threatened to rise and consume, had become a frozen ballroom for ordinary wonder. A widow who once refused to speak of her grief began sculpting birds from snow. She placed them along windowsills, rooftops, even on the chapel steps. They melted by the midday, but she built more. Each one had a different tilt of head, as though listening. "They don't last," she said, "but neither do the bad days. Everything gets a turn." Her hands, red from the cold, moved with purpose, shaping fleeting wings from stillness. One night a child placed a small bowl of berries by the chapel. No one knew why. The next morning a bird was seen picking from it. The day after, someone added seeds, then a handful of dried corn. It became a ritual, offering to the sky's smallest travellers. The villagers didn't call it charity, they called it conversation, a dialogue between the grounded and the airborne. A blacksmith who had once forged only tools began crafting wind chimes from scraps of metal. Hung from doorways and tree limbs, they sang with each passing gust. Their sounds weren't always harmonious, but they were honest. Sharp, soft, uneven melodies that reminded listeners the wind doesn't need permission to make music. It just needs something willing to respond. Someone left a blank book in the centre of the square with a single note. Write what you're too afraid to say aloud. By the end of the week, its pages were full. Scribbles, drawings, unfinished sentences, some angry, some broken, some hopeful. No one claimed the book, but no one took it away either. A second one appeared the next week, and a third. The village had found a new language, one built on vulnerability. And through each small act, the village grew, not outward, not in numbers, but in depth. They hadn't built walls or towers or traded goods with faraway cities, but they had learned to live close to the earth, to each other and to themselves. Each ritual, each kindness, each moment of softness stitched them into a fabric so tightly woven that even the fiercest storms could not pull it apart. As the 30th cycle of cold gave way to the first green threads of spring, the village did not erupt into celebration. There were no banners strung across the market square, no loud declarations of triumph. Instead, the people met the changing season with a hush, a stillness born not from fear but from reverence. They had endured not by conquering winter, but by learning to move with it, by listening to its silence instead of resisting it, by finding each other when everything else seemed lost. In a small corner garden that used to be nothing more than rocks and brittle soil, the first crocus pushed through. Not grand, not blooming in colour like a firework, but steady, brave, almost invisible at first. A child saw it before anyone else and whispered, as if afraid it might vanish. "Look!" That single word travelled through the village like a message. Not shouted, not passed with urgency, just softly spoken from one to another, until every pair of eyes turned toward the tiny purple bloom. No one touched it. They just stood there, quietly remembering all the things that had refused to die. An elder sat in the doorway of her home with a basket in her lap, filled with spools of thread. She wasn't sewing anything, she was simply unwinding the colours, letting reds tangle with blues, gold stretch across the cold stone floor. A boy asked what she was making and she said, "I'm letting time be messy for a while." The boy nodded, not because he understood, but because he felt the truth in it. Later he returned with string and tied it between fence posts, watching it flutter in the breeze like invisible stories caught mid-sentence. At the riverbank, a young woman placed a boat made of waxed leaves and twigs into the water. It wobbled, nearly sank, then righted itself and began to drift. She didn't watch it long, just smiled and turned away. She said she wasn't sending a message. She was giving the water something to carry besides sorrow. There was a new silence in the village, not heavy or sharp, but vast and soft like wool. A quiet that came not from emptiness, but from completion. It was the hush that follows after something long and difficult has passed. Not because everything is fixed, but because people have stopped needing to fix it. They had learned to hold broken things in their hands without rushing to glue them. They had learned that sometimes the cracks themselves became the art. The boy with the lantern now walked at dawn, not dusk, his light still glowing with fireflies from the evening before. He said mornings deserved just as much light as nights did, and people met him with bread and tea, small gifts pressed into his free hand, which he never refused. He was no longer just a boy with a lantern, he was the keeper of beginnings, A woman who had once kept her heart wrapped in abundance began telling stories to trees. Not loudly, not for an audience. Just whispered tales of memories, of fears, of moments that had no home until now. One day she tied a ribbon around the oldest tree in the woods and said, "Now you know me." That tree, already scarred and bent by years of wind and weight, seemed to stand taller. A man built a bench facing nothing in particular, just a patch of sky framed between two buildings. When someone asked why, he shrugged. Sometimes the sky is enough. It became the most visited seat in the village. People sat with arms folded or hands clasped, heads tilted upward, not expecting answers but finding peace in the space between questions. Children began collecting mud under their nails, drawing constellations in it, calling it star dirt. One said he could feel the moon breathing in the earth. No one argued. Adults began kneeling beside them, tracing dreams into soil, softened by thaw. "It's not dirty," said one girl. "It's history before it's finished." A man carved a staircase into the hill, just 3 steps. It led nowhere. It wasn't meant to. He said sometimes you just need to climb, even if there's no summit. People walked it daily, some stepping off the top and back down again, others pausing at the 3rd step as if waiting for a view only they could see. A woman painted doors on blank walls, not real doors, just outlines, shadows, hints of possibility. She said it was for people who needed to imagine an escape, even if they never used it. One of those doors had the word almost written above it. No one painted over it. The chapel no longer rang its bell for tradition. It rang whenever someone found a reason to feel. It rang for someone's first breath. It rang for forgiveness between neighbours. It rang when someone made the perfect loaf of bread after weeks of trying. Each sound of the bell was different, and each carried something raw through the air. A girl began leaving bowls of water outside her door each evening. When asked why, she said, "For the dreams too tired to make it home." People began doing the same. The wind shifted through the village like a sigh of thanks. Maybe it was just superstition. Maybe it was mercy. The woman who once couldn't speak above a whisper now sang lullabies to the moon. She didn't care who heard. Her voice cracked and soared like wings that had once been broken and healed out of order. Her song wasn't perfect, but it was true, and the moon, whether listening or not, never failed to rise. One day, without announcement, the snow melted in a single afternoon. Not slowly, not in pieces, just gone. Water ran through the alleys and soaked into the fields like a great exhale. No one cheered. No one panicked. They simply watched as the white was replaced by big brown, and the pen's brown began hinting at green. The land, once sealed under layers of silence, began to breathe again. And as the village shifted with the season, so too did its people. They didn't erase the memory of struggle. They didn't try to forget the pain. But they had learned to live beside it, like a quiet friend who no longer needed to dominate every conversation. The cold would come again, that much they knew, but now it would not be faced with dread. It would be met with a deep, patient wisdom, a knowing born not of books or prophecy, but of touch, sound, ritual and time. They had built nothing grand. No monuments, no towers, no roads paved in gold. But they had created something rarer. A way of being. A community made not by design, but by the gentle insistence that life, no matter how brittle, could still be beautiful if held with care. And in the soft breath between winter's final sigh and spring's first whisper, that village, unspectacular on any map, unknown to the world, became something eternal. Not because it lasted forever, but because in the hardest times it remembered how to love.